The Audio Partners Incorporated is pleased to present Dance Hall of the Dead by Tony Hillerman, read by Michael and Sarah.
Sunday, November 30th, 5:18 p.m. Shulawitsi, the little fire god, member of the Council of Gods and deputy to the sun, had taped his track shoes to his feet. He had wound the tape his coach taught him tight over the arch of the foot. And now the spikes biting into the packed earth of the sheep trail seemed a part of him. He ran with perfectly conditioned grace, his body a machine in motion. He knew now, with an exultant certainty, that he would be ready. His lungs had expanded, his leg muscles hardened. In 2 days, when he led the Council of the Gods from the ancestral village to Zuñi, fatigue would not cause him to make any missteps in the ritual dance. And when Shalako came, he would be ready to dance all the night without error. The Salamobia would never have to punish him. The fire god half fell onto the outcropping of rock that was his regular resting place. He sat on the outcrop, a slender boy with black hair falling damp across his forehead, massaging his legs through the cotton of his sweatpants. He turned his thoughts to George Bowlegs, careful to avoid any anger. 8 days hence, Shalako would come from the dance hall of the dead to visit their people and bless them. This was no time for angry thoughts. Bowlegs was his friend, but Bowlegs was crazy. And he had reason to be angry with him. George had asked too many questions, and since George was a friend, he had given more answers than he should have given. No matter how badly he wanted to be a Zuñi, George was still a Navajo. He had not been initiated, had not felt the darkness of the mask slip over his head, and seen through the eyes of the Kachina spirit. And therefore there were things that George was not allowed to know, and some of those things the fire god thought glumly he might have told George. Father Ingles didn't think so, but Father Ingles was a white man. Behind him, above the red sandstone wall of the mesa, a skyscape of feathery cirrus clouds stretched southward, flushed with the afterglow of sunset. Far below him, in the shadow of the mesa, a light went on in the camper near the site of the anthropologist's dig. Ted Isaacs cooking supper, the fire god thought. And that was another thing not to think about, to avoid being angry with George. It had been George's idea to see if they could find some of the things made by the old people in the doctor's box of chips and beads and arrowheads. He would make use of it in a hunting fetish, George had said. And the doctor had been furious, and now Isaacs would not let anyone come any more to watch him work. Crazy George. The fire god rubbed his legs. He would run again, cover the last mile down the mesa slope to where George would be waiting with his bicycle. Then he would go home and finish his homework. He ran again, moving first at a slow jog and then faster as his stiffness left. Sweat again dampened the back of his sweatshirt, darkening the stenciled letters that said, "Property of Zuñi Consolidated Schools." Under the angry red sky he ran, into the thickening darkness, thinking of Crazy George as oldest and best friend. He thought of George collecting cactus buttons for the doper at the hippie commune, and eating them himself in search of visions, of George wanting to quit being a Navajo so he could be a Zuñi. And here now was his bicycle, and George would be waiting. The figure which stepped from behind the boulders in the red darkness was not George. It was a Salamobia, its round, yellow-circled eyes staring at him. The fire god stopped, opened his mouth, and found nothing to say. This was a Salamobia of the Mokiva, its mask painted the color of darkness. And yet it was not. The fire god stared at the figure, the muscular body and the dark shirt, the bristling ruff of turkey feathers surrounding the neck, the black and empty eyes, the fierce beak, the plumed feathered topknot. Black was the color of the mole Salamobia. But this was not the mask. He knew that mask. It lived as a shrine in his mother's uncle's home. But if it was not the mask— The fire god saw then that the wand rising in the hand of this Salamobia was not a woven yucca. It glittered in the red light of the twilight. And he remembered that Salamobia, like all of the ancestor spirits, were visible only to members of the sorcery fraternity and to those about to die. Monday, December 1st, 12:20 p.m. Navajo Police Lieutenant Joe Leaphorn should have been listening to Ed Pasquante, who was perched on a swivel chair behind the desk marked Chief of Police, Zuñi. But Leaphorn already understood. Pasquante wanted to make sure that Leaphorn and McKinley County Deputy Sheriff Orange Naranjo and State Policeman J.D. Highsmith understood that on the Zuñi reservation, the Zuñi police would be running the investigation. And that was fine with Leaphorn. The sooner he got away from here, the happier he'd be. He had been struggling against illogical hostility all morning, ever since he had been handed the message which had sent him over here. Typical of the radio messages Leaphorn received from Shiprock, it said too little. Leaphorn was to drive over to Zuñi without delay to help find George Bowlegs, 14, a Navajo. Other details would be available from Zuñi police with whom Leaphorn was instructed to cooperate. The radio man had grinned when he handed it over. "You know anything about this George Bowlegs?" Leaphorn had asked. The radio man wasn't sure, but maybe the boy was the son of a guy named Shorty Bowlegs who had moved off somewhere, and maybe he was the wrong man anyway. Leaphorn drove down to Mexico 53 towards Zuñi a little faster than he should, his bad mood bothering him because he could find no logical reason to explain it. Why resent this assignment? The job that had taken him to Rama had been onerous enough to make an interruption welcome. An old Navajo singer had complained that he had given a neighbor woman $800 to take into Gallup and make a down payment on a pickup truck, and the woman had spent his money. The woman said the singer owed her the money and that the singer was a witch. Leaphorn could think of no way to resolve that problem, and ordinarily he would have welcomed even a temporary escape from it, but he found himself resenting this job, hunting a fellow Navajo at the behest of Zuñi's. Pasquante's voice rattled on. Leaphorn suddenly understood his mood. It was because he felt that Zuñi's felt superior to Navajos. And he felt this because he, Joe Leaphorn, had once a long time ago had a Zuñi roommate during his freshman year at Arizona State about whom he had developed a silly inferiority complex. Therefore his present mood wasn't at all logical, and Leaphorn disliked illogic in others and detested it in himself. "Here's what we know so far," Pasquante was saying. He shuffled a Xerox page to each of them. 2 boys missing, and a pretty good bet that one of them got cut. Leaphorn scanned the page quickly, and then, abruptly interested, went back over it carefully. 2 boys missing. Bowlegs and a Zuñi named Ernesto Cata, and the Cata boy's bicycle and a large expanse of blood soaked into the ground where the bicycle had been left. "It says here they're classmates," Leaphorn said. "Both in the 7th grade, Pasquante said. They'd been close friends 2-3 years, good friends." "No trace of a weapon?" Naranjo asked. "Nothing," Pasquante said. "Just blood. The weapon could have been anything that will let the blood out of you, but I'd guess it wasn't a gun. Nobody remembers hearing a shot, and it happened close enough to the village so somebody would have heard. I'd guess it was something that chopped. There was blood sprayed on the needle's pinion there. Anyway, whoever it was must have taken a weapon with him." "Whoever?" Leaphorn said. "Then you're not all that sure Bowlegs is the one." Pasquante looked at him. "All we know is down there, the Cata boy didn't come home last night. They went out looking for him when it got daylight, and they found the blood where he left his bicycle. The Bowlegs kid borrowed the bike, and he was supposed to bring it back there to that meeting place they had, okay? So the Bowlegs boy shows up at school this morning, but when we find out about the borrowed bike and send a man over there to talk to him, He's gone. Leaphorn tapped the page. It says here that Carter had gone out to run. What was it? Track team? The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, long enough to tell Leaphorn the answer wouldn't be track team. It would be something to do with a Zuñi religion. Pasquante was deciding exactly how much he wanted them to know before he opened his mouth. This Carter boy had been selected to have a part in the religious ceremonials this year, Pasquante said. Some of those ceremonials last for hours. The dancing is hard. He was running every morning to keep in condition. Leaphorn was remembering the Shalico ceremonial he'd attended a long time ago. Was Carter the one they called the fire god? Yeah. Carter was Shalawitsi. Pasquante looked uncomfortable. I don't imagine that has anything to do with this, though. Leaphorn thought about it. Probably not, he decided. He wished he knew more about the Zuñi religion. But that wouldn't be his problem anyway. His problem would be finding George Bowlegs. Pasquante was fumbling through a folder. The only picture we have of the boy so far is the one in the school yearbook. He handed each of them a page of photos, 2 of the faces circled with red ink. Pasquante got up. I'm going to ask Lieutenant Leaphorn to concentrate on trying to find George Bowlegs. We'll be working on trying to find Ernesto and anything else we can find out. They'll need to know where Bowlegs lived. It's about 4 miles out to where Shorty Bowlegs has his hogan. We went out, but we didn't learn anything. Pasquante looked slightly embarrassed. Shorty was there, but he was too drunk to talk. Okay, did you find any tracks around where you found the blood? A lot of bicycle tracks. Then there was a place where somebody wearing moccasins had been standing around. Looks like he waited quite a while. Then there was the tracks of Ernesto's track shoes. It's mostly rock in that place. Hard to read anything. You didn't find anything that told you much then? Just that our boy Ernesto Carter had a lot of blood in him. Pasquante smiled at Leaphorn, but the smile was grim. Monday, December 1, 3:50 p.m. The tire blew about halfway back from Shorty Bowlegs' place, reconfirming Leaphorn's belief that days that begin badly tend to end badly. And the left front wheel had slammed into a weed-covered pothole in a rough country track behind Corn Mountain and ruptured its sidewall. Leaphorn set the jack under the front bumper and pumped the jack handle, feeling irritated. Bowlegs had been too drunk for coherent conversation. Pasquante would have given up on finding any tracks by now and would simply be waiting. The word would have spread within an hour through every redstone home in the village and across the reservation that one of the sons of the Zuñi was missing and probably dead, and that the Navajo boy who was always hanging around was wanted by the police. If any Zuñi saw George Bowlegs anywhere, Pasquante would know it fast. If Bowlegs headed for Albuquerque or Phoenix or Gallup or hung around Zuñi territory, he would almost certainly be picked up quickly. If he holed up somewhere in Navajo country, that would be Leaphorn's problem. Leaphorn looked down the wagon track at the expanse of wooded mesas and broken canyon country. He saw the beauty, the patterned cloud shadows, the red of the cliffs, and everywhere the blue, gold, and gray of dry country autumn. But soon the north wind would take the last few leaves, and one cold night this landscape would change to solid white. And then George Bowlegs, if he was hiding somewhere in it, would be in trouble. Here the altitude was almost 1.5 miles above sea level, and there was already hard frost in the mornings. With the first storm, the mornings would be sub-zero. There would be no way to find food with snow blowing. On the first day, George Bowlegs would be hungry, and then he would be weak, and then he would freeze. Leaphorn grimaced and turned back to the jack. It was then he saw the boy standing there shyly, not 50 feet away, waiting to be noticed. He recognized him instantly from the yearbook photograph. The same rounded forehead, the same wide-set, alert eyes, the same wide mouth. Leaphorn pumped the jack handle. "Yetahe," he said. "Yetahe, uncle. The boy had a book covered with butcher paper in his hand. "You want to help change the wheel? I could use some help." "Okay. Give me the trunk key and I'll get the spare." Leaphorn fished the keys out of his pocket, realizing now that this boy was too young to be George Bowlegs. He would be Cecil, the younger brother. Cecil brought the spare while Leaphorn removed the last lug nuts. Leaphorn was thinking hard. He would be very careful. "You're a Navajo policeman," the boy said. "I thought at first it was the Zuñi patrol car." "The car belongs to the Dine, just like you and I, just like George, your brother." A flicker of surprise crossed the boy's face, and then it was blank. "We are all the people." The boy glanced at him, silent. "It would be a good thing if George talked to a Dine policeman." Leaphorn stressed the word Dine, which meant the people. "You're hunting him? You think he ran away because he killed that Ernesto?" "I don't think George ran away because he killed the Carter boy." Leaphorn removed the left front wheel and carefully fit the spare on the lug nuts, not looking at Cecil. "Running away wasn't smart. Made the Zuñis think he was the one. Probably they will catch him, and then it will be worse for him. And if they don't catch him, he'll have to run all the rest of his life." Leaphorn reached for the lug wrench, looking at Cecil now. "That is a bad way to live." The silence ticked away. Cecil licked his lips. "George didn't run because he was afraid of the Zuñi police." "Why then, nephew?" "It was a Kachina." The boy's voice was so faint Leaphorn wasn't sure he had heard it. "He ran away from the Kachina." "What Kachina?" Leaphorn stared at Cecil. The word Kachina had three meanings. They were the ancestor spirits of the Zuñi, or the masks worn to impersonate these spirits, or the small wooden dolls the Zuñis made to represent them. "I don't know its name, but I guess it would be the same Kachina that got Ernesto." "Oh?" Leaphorn tested the tightness of the lug nuts, lowered the jack, giving himself time to think. He rested his hip on the fender and looked at Cecil Bowlegs. "Did a Kachina get Ernesto Carter?" Cecil caught his lower lip between his teeth. He looked past Leaphorn, thinking. "Do you know why George is running away from this Kachina?" "I think it's the same reason." "Whatever it is, it would make the Kachina go after both of them?" "Yeah." "I guess that Ernesto and George must have done something that made the Kachina mad." "Well, Ernesto did it. George just listened to him. Telling is what breaks the taboo, and Ernesto told. George just listened." It was very important to him that no one think his brother had broken a Zuñi taboo. "Told what?" "Well, I don't know, but it was something about the Kachinas." Leaphorn sat down on the dead grass, folded his legs in front of him. What he had to find out was fairly simple. Did George know the Carter boy was dead when George and Cecil left for school this morning? If he knew that, it would almost certainly mean that George had either killed Ernesto or had seen him killed. Leaphorn fished out his cigarettes. He didn't like what he was about to do. "My job is to find George Bowlegs," he told himself. "It's important to find him." "Do you sometimes smoke a cigarette?" He extended the pack. Cecil took one. "Sometimes it's good." "It's never good. Hurts the lungs. But sometimes it's necessary, and therefore one does it." Cecil sat on a rock, inhaled deeply, and let the smoke trickle out of his nostrils. Obviously, it wasn't his first experience with tobacco. "Do you know when George got home last night?" "Well, after I was asleep. He was there when I woke up this morning, getting ready to catch a school bus." "You boys like school better than I did. When I was a boy, I would have told my daddy probably no school today because one of the students got killed yesterday. Maybe he'd let me stay home." The tone was casual, bantering. Maybe he would elicit an unguarded admission. "I didn't know about it yet, not till we got to school." Cecil was staring at Leaphorn. "They didn't find the blood till this morning." Cecil's expression said he was wondering how this policeman could have forgotten that, and then he knew Leaphorn hadn't forgotten. The boy's face was briefly angry, then simply forlorn. He looked away. "To hell with it," Leaphorn said. "Look, Cecil, I was trying to trick you into telling me more than you want to tell me. Well, to hell with that. He's your brother. You think about it. And then you tell me just what you'd want a policeman to know." "What do you want to know? Where George is? I don't know that." "You say he didn't tell you this morning that something had happened to Carter, but he gave you the idea that a Kachina was after both of them. What did he say?" "Well, I was kind of confused. I guess he borrowed Ernesto's bike after school, and he took it back to where Ernesto was running, and he was waiting there for Ernesto. It was getting dark, and I guess it was then he saw the Kachina coming, and he ran away from there. He didn't say it that way exactly, but that's what I think happened. When we got to school today, he was going to find out about the Kachina." "If you were me, where would you look for him?" Cecil said nothing. He looked down at his shoes. "Okay, then has he got any other friends? Anybody else who I should talk to?" "No friends there at school. They're Zuñis." Cecil glanced at Leaphorn to see if he understood. "They don't like Navajos. Just make jokes about us, like Pollock jokes." "But everybody says Ernesto and George were friends." "Well, everybody says George is kind of crazy. It's because he wants to do things, you know. He wants to try everything. One time he wanted to be a witch, and then he studied about Zuñi sorcery. And one time he was eating cactus buttons so he would have dreams. And Ernesto thought all that was fun, and he made George worse than he was about it. I don't think Ernesto was a friend. Not really a friend." Cecil's face was angry. "He was a goddamn Zuñi." "How about anybody else?" "There's those white men who are doing all that digging for the arrowheads. George used to go there a lot and watch that one man dig. Used to hang around there most of the summer. But Ernesto stole something, I think, and they ran him off." Leaphorn had noticed the anthropology site and had asked Pasquante about it. It was less than a mile from where the blood had been found. "Like stole what? When did that happen?" "Well, just the other day. I think Ernesto stole some of that flint they dug up. I think it was arrowheads and stuff like that." Leaphorn started to ask why they would steal flint artifacts, but bit off the question. Why did boys steal anything? Mostly to see if they could get away with it. "And then there's those Balakani living over in the old Hogans behind Hosky Butte," Cecil said. "George liked that blonde girl over there, and she was trying to teach him to play the guitar, I think." "White people? Who are these Balakani?" "Hippies," Cecil said. Monday, December 1, 4:18 p.m. Ted Isaacs ran the shovel blade carefully into the dusty earth. The pressure on the heel of his hand told him that he was digging slightly above the high calcium layer, which Isaacs now knew with absolute certainty was a Folsom floor. He dumped the earth on the pile on the sifter screen. He leaned the shovel against the wheelbarrow and began sorting the soft earth through the wire with a worn trowel. He worked steadily and fast. Within 3 minutes, nothing was left on the screen except an assortment of pebbles, small twigs, old rabbit droppings. Isaac sorted carefully through the pebbles. He was a tall, bony young man. His hands worked with delicate speed, blunt, calloused fingers eliminating most of the stones automatically, finally pausing with a chip no larger than a toenail clipping. This chip Isaacs examined, squinting and concentration. It was a chip of agate flint, the third he had found this morning. He fished a jeweler's glass from the pocket of his denim shirt. Through the double lens, the chip loomed huge. On one edge there was a scar he knew he would find, the point of percussion, The mark left 100 centuries ago when a Folsom hunter had flaked it off whatever tool he had been making. The thought aroused in Isaacs a sense of excitement, an exhilarating sense of making a quantum leap backward through time. Isaac stuffed the glass back in his pocket and extracted an envelope. He wrote Grid 4 North 7 West on it in a small, neat hand and dropped in the flake. It was then he noticed the white panel truck jolting up the ridge toward him. "Crap," Isaac said. He stared at the truck, hoping it would go away. It didn't. It kept bumping inexorably toward him, following the tracks his own truck camper had left through the grama grass. And finally it stopped a polite 50 feet below. The door of the carryall bore a round seal with a stylized profile of a buffalo, and the man who got out of it and was now walking toward Isaac's wore the same seal on the shoulder of his khaki shirt. The man had an Indian face. "What can I do for you?" Isaac said. "Just looking for some information. My name's Leaphorn. I'm with the Navajo Police." "Ted Isaacs." They shook hands. "We're looking for a couple of boys. A Navajo about 14 named George Bowlegs, and a Zuñi named Ernesto Cata. I understand they hang around here a lot." "They did, but not lately." Isaacs paused, remembering the scene Reynolds' yell of outrage and anger and Cata running from Reynolds' pickup as if hell itself pursued him. The memory was a mixture of amusement and regret. It had been funny, but he missed the boys, and Reynolds had made it clear enough in his direct way that he didn't think much of Isaac's judgment in letting them hang around. "We ran 'em off." "Why?" "Well, this is a research site, not the best place in the world for a couple of boys to be horsing around." Leaphorn said nothing. The silence stretched. Time ticking silently away made Isaacs nervous, but the Indian seemed unaware of it. He simply waited, his eyes black and patient, for Isaacs to say more. "Reynolds caught them screwing around in his truck," Isaac said, resenting the Indian for making him say it. "What did they steal?" "Steal? Well, nothing. Not that I know of. One of them was a Dr. Reynolds' truck, and Reynolds, well, he yelled at them to get the hell away from his stuff, and they ran away." "Nothing missing?" "No. Why are you looking for them?" "Well, they're missing." Again the silence, the Indian's face thoughtful. "You're digging up artifacts here, I guess. Could they have gotten off with any of that stuff?" Isaac's laughed. "Over my dead body." The very thought made him nervous. "You're absolutely sure, then?" "Reynolds thought they might have gotten something out of his toolbox, I think, because he checked it, but nothing was gone." "No artifacts missing, not even chips?" "No way. I keep what I find in my shirt pocket here." Isaacs tapped the envelopes. "Why do you think they stole something?" The Indian didn't seem to hear the question. He was looking toward Corn Mountain. Then he shrugged. "I heard they did." "What are you digging up here? Some sort of early man site?" The question surprised Isaacs. "Yeah, it was a Folsom hunting camp. You know about the Folsom culture?" "Some. I studied a little anthropology at Arizona State." "You heard of Chester Reynolds?" "I think he wrote one of my textbooks." "Probably that was Paleo-Indian cultures in North America. Reynolds worked out a set of maps of the way this part of the country looked back at the end of the last ice age, back when it was raining so much. From that, he worked out the game migration routes at the very end of the Pleistocene period. You know, where you'd find the mastodons and ground sloths and the saber-toothed cats and the longhorn bison because of surface water and climate when this country started drying up. And from that, he worked out the methods of calculating where the Folsom hunters were likely to have their hunting camps. That's what this was." Isaacs gestured across a gridwork of strings waffling the grassy ridge. "That flat place down there was a lake then. Folsom could sit up here on his haunches and see everything that came to water, either at the lake or north toward the Zuñi Wash." Isaacs accepted a cigarette from Leaphorn. He sat on the frame of the sifter screen looking tired and excited. And he talked. He talked as a naturally friendly man will talk when confronted after days of enforced silence with a good listener. He talked of how Reynolds had given the sites to selected doctoral candidates, arranging foundation grants to finance the work. He talked of Reynolds' modification theory, which would solve one of the great mysteries of American anthropology. Leaphorn, who had always been fascinated by the unexplained, remembered the mystery from Anthropology 127. Folsom hunting camps had been found all over the central and southwestern states, generally dating from as early as 12,000 to as late as 9,000 years ago. During this era, at the tag end of the Ice Age, they seem to have had this immense expanse of territory to themselves. They followed the bison herds, living in small camps where they chipped their lance points, knives, hide scrapers, and other tools from flint. These lance points were their trademark. They were leaf-shaped, small, remarkably thin, their faces fluted like bayonets, their points and cutting edges shaped by an unusual technique called pressure flaking. Making such a point was difficult and time-consuming. Other Stone Age people later and earlier made larger, cruder points, quick and easy to chip out and no less efficient at killing. But Folsom stuck to his beautiful but difficult designs century after century and left anthropology with a puzzle. Was the lance point part of a ritual religion? Its shape a magic offering to the spirit of the animals that fed Folsom with her meat? When the glaciers stopped melting, and the great rain ended, and the country dried, and the animal herds diminished, Folsom camps disappeared from the earth. Had Folsom men been trapped by this time-consuming ritualism, which delayed his adaptation and caused his extinction? Whatever the reason, he vanished. There was a gap when the Great Plains seemed to have been virtually empty of men, and then different hunting cultures appeared, killing with long, heavy lance points and using different stoneworking techniques. Yeah, Isaac said. That's about the way the books explain it. But thanks to Reynolds, they're going to have to rewrite all those books. You going to prove something else happened? Yeah, we damn sure are. Isaac slit another cigarette, puffing nervously. Let me tell you what those bastards did. 2 years ago, when Reynolds started working on this, he read a paper on his theory at the Anthro Convention, and some of those stuffy old academic bastards walked out on him. Pretty serious insult, I guess. The worst kind. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. They say Reynolds was ready to kill somebody. He's not used to that kind of treatment, and he's not the kind of man you push on. They said he told some of his friends there he'd make those people accept his theory if it took the rest of his life. What's the Reynolds theory? Well, in brief, Folsom man did not die out. He adapted. He began making a different kind of lance point. Some of those we've been crediting to entirely different cultures, and by God, we're going to prove it right here. It seemed to Leaphorn a hard case to prove. Any chance of talking to Reynolds? Well, he's coming in this evening. Come on down to the camper. We can wait for him there. I'll show you what we're finding. The camper was a plywood box built on the bed of a battered old Chevy pickup truck. The inside was fitted with a narrow bunk, a linoleum-topped work table, and an array of metal filing cabinets. Isaacs unlocked a cabinet, extracted a tray of grimy envelopes, counted them carefully, and then put all but one back. He opened the envelope, poured its contents carefully into his hand, and then extended his open palm to Leaphorn. In it lay 4 chips of flint and a flat rectangle of pink stone. It was perhaps 3 inches long, 1 inch wide, and a 1/2 inch thick. It's the butt end of a lance point, Isaac said. The type we call parallel flaked. The type we always thought was made by a culture that followed Folsom. He pushed it with a finger. Notice it's made out of petrified wood, silicified bamboo to be exact. And notice these chips are the same stuff. And now, he tapped the side of the stone with a fingernail, notice that it isn't finished? He was still smoothing off this side when the tip snapped off. So, that means he was making it up there at your Folsom hunting camp, and that he didn't just come along and drop it. But he still could have been making it a couple of thousand years after the Folsoms were gone. The date's right. Our geologist tells us that high calcium layers were only formed about 9,000 years ago, so these were very late Folsoms. Isaac's eyes were looking at a scene very distant in time. There weren't many left. They were starving. The glaciers were long gone, and the rains had stopped, and the game herds were going fast. It was getting hotter. The desert was spreading, and the culture they had lived by for 3,000 years was failing them. They had to make a big kill at least every 4 or 5 days. If they didn't, they'd be too weak to hunt and they'd die. There just wasn't enough time anymore to make those fancy points that broke so easily. Leaphorn watched as Isaacs talked, and tried to guess his age. Late 20s, he thought. But something had aged him. Isaacs was conscious Leaphorn had noticed earlier of his teeth. They were slightly buck, and they protruded a little, and Isaacs called attention to them by unconsciously putting his hand to his face, shielding his mouth. Isaacs leaned against the wall, looking at Leaphorn. It's always been presumed that they couldn't adapt, so they died. That's the textbook dogma. But it's wrong. They were human and smart. They had the intelligence to appreciate beauty and the intelligence to adapt. I wonder, though, Leaphorn said, would changing a lance point make that much difference? Probably not by itself, but quite a bit. I can make a very rough version of a Folsom point in 2 or 3 hours on the average. They're so thin that you break a lot, and so did the Folsom men. But you can whack out a big parallel flake point in maybe 20 minutes. We think the Folsom point, with all that symmetry, was a sort of ritual offering to the animal spirit. He made it just as beautiful as he could make it. You're a Navajo, you know what I mean. I know. Leaphorn was remembering a snowy morning on the Lukachukai Plateau, his grandfather touching the barrel of his old 30-30 with sacred pollen, and then the chant. The old man's clear voice calling to the spirit of the male deer to make his hunt for the winter's meat right and proper and in tune with natural things, giving it the beauty of the Navajo way. Reynolds figured, and he's right, that if Folsom was willing to change his lance point, he'd be willing to adapt in every other way. Under the old way, they'd be sitting in a camp all day, turning out maybe 5 or 6 of those fluted points, and maybe breaking 10 or 12 to make a kill. They couldn't afford that anymore. Couldn't afford the beauty? I went to a Bureau of Indian Affairs high school that had a sign in the hall. It said, "Tradition is the enemy of progress." The word was, give up the old ways or die. He didn't mean it to sound bitter, but Isaacs gave him a quizzical look. By the way, have you asked the people over at Jason's Fleece about those boys? The hippie place? They hung around there some. There's a girl over there that's a good friend of theirs. Nice girl named Suzanne. The boys liked her. I'll go talk to her. That Bowlegs boy's a funny kid. He's sort of a mystic, interested in magic and witchcraft and all that sort of thing. George was, well, he was studying to be a Zuñi. You mean studying the religion? He said Ernesto was going to get him initiated into the Badger clan. Could that happen? I don't know. I doubt it. I think it's like a fish saying it's going to become a bird. Outside, there was the sound of a motor whining in second gear, driving too fast over the bumpy track. Reynolds? That's the way the silly bastard drives. Reynolds was not what Leaphorn had expected. He was medium-sized, perhaps 50, but hard to date. Brown hair turning gray in spots, a round, cheerful face with a field anthropologist's leathery complexion. Only his eyes set him apart. Protected by a heavy brow ridge above and a lump of cheekbone below, they stared from their sockets with sharp, unblinking, bright blue alertness. They gave Leaphorn the feeling that everything about his face was being memorized, and a moment later they were studying with equal intensity the chips Isaac had found that day. Joe Leaphorn, Navajo policeman, had been sorted and stored out of the way. "Which grid?" Reynolds asked. Isaacs touched 3 fingers to the map. "These." "You're not missing anything?" "I never do." "I know you don't." Reynolds favored Isaacs with a glance that included fondness, warmth, and approval. "By God, it really looks good." "Very good. I think this is going to be it." "Yes, I think so." Reynolds was staring at Isaacs. "Nothing is going wrong with this dig, you understand that? It is going to be done exactly right." A good hater, Leaphorn thought. Maybe a little crazy, maybe just a genius. Reynolds' gaze now included Leaphorn. "Mr. Leaphorn's looking for a couple of boys," Isaac said. "He stopped by to ask if I'd seen them." "Was one of them a Zuñi kid that was screwing around my truck?" "That's the one. I'd heard they stole something here." Reynolds' bright eyes flicked instantly to Isaac's. "Did they steal something?" "No. I told him that. Nothing's missing." "The Zuñi boy and a Navajo named George Bowlegs. They're both gone. Did they steal something from you, Dr. Reynolds?" "That Zuñi boy was poking around my truck, but nothing was missing. Frankly, I ran him off because it was beginning to look like this is a critically important site." Reynolds glanced at Isaacs. "It's damn sure no place to have unauthorized persons underfoot, especially not children." "Was there anything in the pickup they might have stolen? Anything valuable?" Reynolds thought about it. "Is it important?" "Those boys are missing. We think one of them was hurt. We need to know why they disappeared. Might help figure out where they are." "Let's look then." Outside, the red sky was fading into darkness. The early stars were out. Reynolds fished a flashlight out of the glove box of a green GMC pickup. He checked the remaining contents. "Nothing missing here." It took a little longer to check the toolbox welded behind the cab. Reynolds sorted carefully through the clutter: pliers, wire cutters, geologist's pick, folding shovel, and a dozen other odds and ends. He closed the box. "All accounted for." "On the day you ran the boys off, did you have any artifacts in a truck? Arrowheads, lance points, anything like that?" The Reynolds thought about the question. "By God, I did. Had my box with me." "I heard one of the boys stole an arrowhead. Was anything missing from the box?" "You can be damn sure there wasn't. That box had stuff in it from all 8 of the digs I'm watching. If a single flake was taken out of there, I'd know it. It's all there." He frowned. "Who told you it stole some artifacts?" "It's third hand. The Navajo boy has a little brother. He told me." "Well, that's funny." Leaphorn said nothing, but he thought. "Yes, that's very funny." Monday, December 1, 8:37 p.m. The moon now hung halfway up the sky, its face scarred white ice. Under it, Leaphorn was cold. He sat in the shadow of the rim rock watching the commune which called itself Jason's Fleece. The cold seeped through Leaphorn's uniform jacket, through his shirt and undershirt. It touched the backs of his hands which gripped the metal of his binoculars. In a moment Leaphorn intended to deal with the cold. He would get up and climb briskly down to the commune below him and learn there whatever it was possible for him to learn. And now he ignored the discomfort, concentrating in his orderly fashion on this minor phase of the job of finding George Bowlegs. But before he entered the commune, he would study it. At the moment Leaphorn was examining through the magnification of the binocular lenses a denim jacket. The jacket hung on a post beside a hogan some 200 yards below where Leaphorn sat. The hogan was a neat octagon of logs built as a Navajo way instructed. its single entrance facing the point of sunrise and a smoke hole in the center of the roof. Behind it, Leaphorn could see a pole corral that contained huddled sheep, probably about 20. Leaphorn presumed the sheep belonged to the occupants of the commune, who currently numbered 4 men and 3 women. The allotment of land on which the sheep grazed belonged to Frank Bob Madman, and the hogan, from which a thin plume of smoke now rose into the cold moonlight, belonged by Navajo tradition to the ghost of Alice Madman. Leaphorn had learned this, and considerably more, by stopping at a hogan about 4 miles up the wagon track. With a young Navajo couple who lived there, he had discussed the weather of the couple's newborn son, and finally the group of Belicani who lived in the hogan down the wagon track. He had been told that Frank Bob Madman had abandoned the hogan almost 3 years before. His wife had died there, and no one had been around to move her body out of the hogan so that her ghost, at the moment of death, might escape for its eternity of wandering. Madman had had his wife's body buried, then had knocked a hole in one wall and boarded up the entrance, as was customary with a death hogan, to keep the ghost from bothering people. And then, a year ago last spring, the Belicani had arrived. There had been 16 of them in a school bus and a Volkswagen van. They had moved into the Madman place, living in the death hogan and in 2 big tents. The number had declined during the winter, and in the coldest part of the year, there had been another death in the hogan of the ghost of Alice Madman. The death, Leaphorn asked. Who was it? It had been a young woman, a very fat girl. Maybe it was too much heroin, or maybe the ghost of Alice Madman. The residents of Jason's Fleece were generous, ignorant, friendly, bad-mannered, but well-intentioned. Yes, the visitors had included a Navajo boy who sometimes came by himself, and sometimes came with a Zuñi boy. Leaphorn shifted his field of vision slowly, past the thin plume of vapor rising from the smoke hole of the hogan, then back again. There was an outdoor table, partly in darkness. Beyond it something which might be a saddle, and something hanging which could be a deer carcass. Leaphorn examined it. Something at the corner of his vision tugged at his attention. He shifted the binoculars slightly. Projected onto the hard, bare earth by the slanting moonlight was a shadow of a part of the table, and beside that, the shadow of a pair of legs, motionless. Leaphorn frowned at it. How had he got there without Leaphorn seeing him? As he considered this, the figure moved. With bird-like swiftness, it darted to the side of the hogan. It crouched, pressed against the logs. What the devil was it doing? Listening? It seemed to be. And then the figure straightened, its head moving upward into the slanting moonlight. Leaphorn sucked in his breath. The head was a bird's. Round, jay-like feather plumes thrusting backward, a long, narrow sandpiper's beak, a bristling ruff of feathers where the human neck would be. The head was round. As it turned away from profile, Leaphorn saw round eyes ringed with yellow against the black. He was seeing the staring, expressionless face of a kachina. Leaphorn felt the hairs bristling at the back of his neck. What was it his roommate had said of these spirits of the Zuñi dead? That they danced forever under a lake in Arizona. He remembered that. The man-bird was moving again, away from the hogan to disappear through the darkness among the piñons. The way it's told, he heard the roommate's voice saying. They're invisible, but you can see them if you're about to die. Monday, December 1, 9:11 p.m. The girl named Suzanne spoke with a slight stammer. At the moment she was saying that maybe George Bowlegs was simply ditching school, that George sometimes played hooky to go deer hunting, that probably he was doing this now. Maybe that's so. Leaphorn let the silence stretch. The man called Halsey moved very slightly in his rocking chair, his face hidden behind the black binding of a book. Halsey interested Leaphorn. Where had he come from, and what did he hope to find here? Anyway, Suzanne said, I'm dead sure George didn't do anything to Ernesto. They were like brothers. I heard that. Isaac said the same thing, but that's not the point. We think George can tell us something about what happened. Suzanne's face went blank. I don't know where he is. I talked to George's little brother today. The boy tells me George is running because he's afraid of something. Really afraid. What's George afraid of? Suzanne was listening carefully. She said nothing. The trouble with running this time of year is the weather. Today it's late autumn. Tomorrow maybe it's winter. Overnight snow and maybe 5 or 6 below zero, and all of a sudden you don't have any food and no way to get any. Does it get that cold here? Below zero? Last year it got to 15 below at Rama. We had 11 exposure deaths on the reservation that we know about. But I don't know where he is. Just telling me what he said would help me find him. This time Suzanne let the silence grow. She might tell me he didn't come here, Leaphorn thought, but she wouldn't lie. Not now. At last she said, "He asked if I could give him any food. He wanted to take some of the deer out of the shed. That was George's deer anyway. He brought it to us last week." Try to remember everything he said. Why, he asked me if I knew anything about the Zuñi religion, and I said not much, just a little bit that Ted had told me about it. Suzanne put the memory back together. And then he asked me if Ted had ever told me anything about the Kachinas punishing people. She frowned. And if I knew anything about Kachina forgiveness. Forgiveness? He said, if a Zuñi taboo is broken, is there any way to get absolution? I told him I didn't know anything about it. Any hint of what the forgiveness would be for? Did he say what happened to offend the Kachinas? No. So he took some venison. Suzanne flushed. She tugged the long, grimy sleeve of her sweater down over her knuckles. He didn't take anything, Halsey said. He asked for it. He didn't get it. I figured he was running from the law. People who live here do not aid and abet. He grinned at Leaphorn. We are law-abiding. So he left here without any food? I made him take my old jacket. And he didn't say anything about where he was going? No, not really. He said he might be gone for a while because he had to find the Kachinas. Leaphorn yawned. In a moment he would climb from the truck, open the barbed wire gate, and drive on to Rama. But now he simply sat, surrendering to fatigue. He had heard of George Bowlegs about noon, and now it was after midnight. Bowlegs, you little bastard, where are you? Outside the air was absolutely still, the sky cloudless, the moon almost directly overhead. Tonight there would be a hard freeze. And where were George Bowlegs and Ernesto Cata? Dead? Cata, perhaps. But it seemed suddenly unlikely. There was no possible reason for anyone to kill him. Tomorrow morning he would check with the Zuñi police. They would tell him that Cata had come home during the night and confessed to a silly hoax. Leaphorn guessed what the explanation would be. A sheep slaughtered for the Shalico feast. The boys saving its blood, using it for an elaborate joke, unconscious of the cruelty in it. Leaphorn flicked on the radio transmitter and raised window rock quickly. There were 2 messages for him. The captain wanted to know if he was making any progress on the affair of the embezzled payment for the pickup truck, and the Zuñi Police Department had called and said that Ernesto Cata had been found. Leaphorn frowned at the radio. Found? Is that all they said? Let me check, the dispatcher said. I didn't take the message. Leaphorn rubbed his hand across his face, suppressing a yawn. Found his body, the dispatcher said. Tuesday, December 2, 7:22 a.m. The sun, rising over Oso Ridge, warmed the right side of Joe Leaphorn's face and cast the shadow of his profile against the raw gray earth exposed by the landslide. He stood with his arms folded over his stomach, his ears aware of the scraping sound of the shovels. Sunlight struck the east faces of the Zuñi buttes to the northwest. 3 miles up the valley, it illuminated the early morning haze of smoke from the chimneys of Zuñi village. Much nearer, a yard from the toe of Leaphorn's boot, it lit the scuffed sole of a small, low-cut shoe. The shoe protruded from the earth and stone rubble of the slide, a black shoe, laces down. It was a track shoe. Part of the runner's heel was visible, and the Achilles tendon. The earth covered the rest. Just to Leaphorn's left, Ed Pesquante pushed at the handle of his shovel. Beyond him, 3 other Zuñis worked methodically. They were the father and uncles of Ernesto Cata. They dug with deliberate speed, wordlessly. The earth pile receded, revealing another inch of Ernesto Cata's calf. "Where did you find the bicycle?" Leaphorn asked. He had offered once, 5 minutes ago, when he had first arrived, to help with the digging. "No, thanks," an uncle had said. "We can handle it all right." The earth was Zuñi earth, the body under it flesh of the Zuñi flesh. Leaphorn sensed digging here at this moment in time was not for a Navajo. He wouldn't repeat the offer. "The bike was down there," Pesquante said. He pointed. The bicycle had been remarkably well hidden considering the circumstances. It had been pushed under a sandstone overhang and then disguised with a cover of dead grass and weeds. Even with the camouflage gone, it was hard to see. Leaphorn backtracked to a sheep path down the slope. He checked everything, working slowly. By the time he reached the cluster of trees where Cata had bled out his life, it was noon. There were 5 sets of recent tracks. He eliminated the rubber heel marks left by Pesquante and the waffle-soled boots of the uncle who had found the blood. That left cowboy boots, presumably George Bowlegs, which had dismounted from the bicycle near the trees, Cata's track shoes, and moccasins worn by whoever had pushed the bicycle away with Cata's body as its cargo. Leaphorn sat on a slab of sandstone and considered what these tracks told him. He could guess that the killing hadn't been premeditated, at least not completely. One who plans to carry a body a long distance uphill over rough ground does not wear moccasins. He wears something with sturdy soles and heels. The man who wore moccasins had waited among the junipers out of sight. He could have struck Cata from this ambush, had there been an intention to kill, but he hadn't. The moccasins had stepped out into the open. Moccasins and track shoes had faced one another long enough for several shuffles and shifts of weight. They had stood very close. Then Cata had taken 3 long stride steps downhill and fallen, and pumped his blood out onto the thirsty earth. Leaphorn tried to imagine what Cata and moccasins might have talked about as they stood toe-to-toe. There was not even ground for speculation. Leaphorn was finding no order in his thoughts. There was only the discordant clash of improbable against unlikely, effect without cause, action without motive, patternless chaos. Leaphorn's orderly mind found this painful. There was no pattern here. Cata was dead without reason. George Bowlegs had not run when he should have run, and then he had fled when he shouldn't have. Why had Cecil Bowlegs told him that Cata had stolen artifacts from the early man dig? There was no reason for Cecil to lie, and no reason for the anthropologist to lie in denying such a loss. Why did Cecil think George was running from a vengeful Kachina if George had told Suzanne he would be hunting a Kachina? And what was that strange thing Leaphorn had seen at Jason's fleece, with the body of a man and the head of a bird? Leaphorn began walking rapidly down the slope toward Zuñi village. The body would be there by now, the cause of death known. When there was time, he would learn more about the Zuñi religion. But before he did that, he would get Shorty Bowlegs sober enough to talk, even if he had to lock him up to do it. Tuesday, December 2, 6:11 p.m. The headlights on Joe Leaphorn's van lost themselves one moment in a gust of reddish-gray dust, and the next in a flurry of dry snowflakes. Leaphorn was taking it very slowly. He was in no particular hurry. He had no real hope that Shorty Bowlegs could tell him anything very useful. It was simply that Bowlegs was the last untapped possibility. After Bowlegs, there would be no place left to go. All other possible sources of information had been tapped. The headlights flashed for a second on a sheep corral down the slopes, flicked past the doorway of the Bowlegs Hogan, and the blue-shirted form in its doorway, and stopped. Leaphorn turned off the ignition. He was relieved. Bowlegs was not only awake, but sober enough to be standing in the doorway, curious about his visitor. Bowlegs shook out a cigarette, lit it, and waited. Navajo custom and good manners required the wait. Lieutenant Joe Leaphorn would wait in his truck until Shorty Bowlegs had prepared to receive a visitor. And when Bowlegs was ready, he would stand outside his Hogan door so that Leaphorn would know it. Leaphorn waited now, thinking of the long day behind him, of Kata's body on the table at the Black Rock BIA hospital, the doctor cleaning the sand from the great chopped wound, which had almost severed head from body. An axe, perhaps, or a machete swung with great force. He thought of that, and of where George Bowlegs might be taking shelter on this miserable night, and then, abruptly, he was thinking that it was taking far too long for Shorty Bowlegs to reappear at his Hogan doorway. Leaphorn pushed the van door open against the pressure of the wind, pulling his windbreaker collar around his face, and stepped out, staring at the Hogan. It was totally dark now. Had it been when he drove up? Leaphorn remembered his headlights flashing past its entrance, the figure frozen in that flicker of light. He had presumed it was Bowlegs looking out to see who was driving up on this bitter night. But now there was no sign of light around the plank door. Leaphorn stood a moment beside the carryall, aware of the shrieking curses of the wind, of the evil ghosts of 1,000 generations of Dine who rode the night. And then he reached back inside the cab. He fished a flashlight out of the glove compartment and lifted his .30-30 from the rifle rack across the back window. 10 feet from the Hogan door he stopped. "Yatta-hay!" he shouted. "Shorty Bowlegs! Yatta-hay!" The wind whipped a mixture of dust and snow around Leaphorn's feet. The plank door moved, tapping at its crude casement. He flicked on the flashlight. The wind gusted again, hooting through the Hogan's smoke hole. Now the door moved. Outward, then inward, tapping against its latch. Leaphorn pumped a shell into the .30-30 chamber, held the rifle on his right arm. With his left hand he pulled up the door latch and jerked outward. The wind helped, sucking the door open. Inside nothing moved. The flashlight beam reflected from the galvanized tin of a washtub against the back wall. Leaphorn moved the light clockwise through the Hogan. It passed 3 empty bedrolls, a battered metal chest with its drawers hanging open, past a rope-tied bundle of sheep hides, and stopped finally on the arm of a man. The arm extended limply on the packed earthen floor, the dark wrist thrust out of a sleeve that was khaki, not dark blue. The fingers relaxed, their tips touching the earth. The flashlight now lit black hair, neatly parted, a braid tied with a string, a cloth headband which had been a faded pink but now was dyed, like the hair beneath it, a fresh, bloody crimson. He had found Shorty Bowlegs. He stood for a minute, listening, but the wind made listening useless. He stepped into the Hogan and squatted on his heels. Shorty Bowlegs had been killed with a blow struck from behind with something heavy and sharp, swung by the figure in the blue shirt he had seen at the doorway. And where was that man now? Not more than 5 minutes away, but with wind, snow, dust, and darkness making both ears and eyes useless, he might as well be on another planet. Leaphorn cursed himself. He had seen the killer. He had sat in his truck while the man walked away. Leaphorn tested the blood on Bowlegs' hair with a tentative fingertip. Sticky. Bowlegs had been struck at least 30 minutes before Leaphorn's arrival. The killer had apparently killed Bowlegs first, and then ransacked the Hogan. Outside the hogan, Leaphorn began searching in gradually widening circles. He looked for tracks, human, horse, or vehicle, using his flashlight sparingly in places where they might be preserved from the wind. He found nothing very conclusive. His own van's tires showed up in several places, but no other vehicle had apparently come near the hogan recently. He made a careful inspection of the pen beside the hogan. 2 horses had been kept there. The tracks of one, poorly shod, were only a few hours old. The other had apparently not been around for perhaps a day. Leaphorn squatted on the loamy earth, hunched against the icy wind, thinking about what that might mean. Leaphorn snapped off the light and crouched motionless. The wind had carried an incongruous sound. He listened. Then he heard it again. A bell, and then another, slightly lower in pitch, and a third with a tinny tinkle. The bells approached, and with them the sound of a horse. The dim shape of a white goat tinkled past the tree, followed by a straggling stream of goats and then an almost solid mass of sheep. Finally, there came a horse, and on it a small shape, huddled against the cold. "Yattahay!" he shouted. "Cecil!" Tuesday, December 2, 10:15 p.m. It was almost 2 hours later when Leaphorn reached Zuñi and left Cecil with a young Franciscan brother at St. Anthony's School. Leaphorn had helped Cecil unsaddle a horse and secure the sheep in the brush corral. He had told Cecil as gently as he could that Shorty Bowlegs was dead. He had left Cecil in the cab of the truck then, with the motor running and the heater on high, while he recovered the boy's bedroll and odds and ends of spare clothing from the hogan. He put these, a single shirt, 3 pairs of cheap socks, and underwear, in an empty grocery sack. He handed the sack through the truck window. "Anything else you want out of there?" Cecil stared over his shoulder at the hogan. "Just my lunchbox. That's all I got." In the hogan he found surprisingly little trace of George. A spare shirt, too ragged even for George to wear, and a few odds and ends similarly rejected. Nothing else. Leaphorn added this lack of George's belongings to the absence of the second Bowlegs horse from the corral, and came to the obvious conclusion. George had come back to this hogan yesterday, the day after Kata had died. George had picked up his spare clothing and the horse. He must have been here not long after Leaphorn had made his fruitless first call on Shorty. On his way out of the hogan, Leaphorn saw Cecil's lunchbox. It lay open beside the hogan wall. Leaphorn picked it up. Inside the box were a dozen or so papers once neatly folded but now pawed through and left in disarray. Leaphorn refolded the papers. Under them were a small blue ball, a spark plug, a small horseshoe magnet, the wheel of a toy car, and a stone figure a little larger than Leaphorn's thumb. It was the elongated shape of a mole carved from a piece of antler. 2 thin buckskin thongs secured a tiny chip-flint arrowhead to its top. It was obviously a fetish figure, probably from one of the Zuñi medicine fraternities. It certainly wasn't Navajo. In the van, Cecil was looking through the windshield. He took the box without a word and put it on his lap. "I'm going to leave you at St. Anthony's Mission tonight, unless there's somewhere else that would be better." "No, there's no place else." "Where'd you get that little bone mold?" "George gave it to me." "When George came and got the other horse, what else did he take?" Cecil said nothing. His hands gripped the lunchbox. "Look, don't you think we should find him now?" Cecil suddenly began shaking. Leaphorn put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "He got the horse yesterday evening. I went out to see about the sheep. When I got back, the rifle was gone, and I found the note." Cecil was still staring straight ahead. "And I guess he took his knife. And the stuff he kept in a leather pouch." "Where'd he say he was going?" "The note's in here with my stuff." Cecil unlatched the box and sorted through the papers. I thought I put it in here. He shut the box. Anyway, I remember most of it. He said he couldn't explain it to me exactly, but he was going to find some Kachinas. He said he had to talk to them. He couldn't pronounce the name of the place. He tried to say it, but all I remember was it started with a K. And when he was riding off, he said it'd be gone several days to where this Kachina was taking care of the business he had. And if he couldn't get it done there, then he'd have to go to Shalako over at Zuñi, and then he'd be home. And he said not to worry about him. Was that all he said? Cecil didn't answer. Leaphorn glanced at him. The boy's eyes were wet. No. He said, take care of Dad. Wednesday, December 3, 10 a.m. Joe Leaphorn was having trouble concentrating. The killing of Kata and of Shorty Bowlegs made no sense in themselves. Were they part of something larger? The question cried for every gram of Leaphorn's attention. His head ached with it. Leaphorn would find himself thinking of the late Ernesto Kata, who had, as the Zuñis would say it, completed his path. After 13 years of life, who had been the personifier of the fire god, an altar boy at St. Anthony's Church, a baptized Christian who would almost certainly have become one of the valuable men of the Zuñi religion, had not someone, for some reason, found it expedient to kill him. The voice of the FBI agent John O'Malley intruded itself on Leaphorn's consciousness. Why, he was thinking, were FBI agents so often exactly like O'Malley? He saw that the white man who sat behind O'Malley was grinning at him. This man was maybe 50, with a sagging hound dog face. O'Malley had introduced him simply as Agent Baker. It had occurred to Leaphorn earlier that Baker was not, in fact, an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He didn't look like one. He had an air of casual sloppiness and something about him which suggested a quick, inquisitive, impatient intelligence. Then it occurred to him that he had seen Baker before. It had been in Utah, in the wake of an autopsy of a Navajo rodeo performer who had died of an overdose of heroin. Baker had been there, offering the sheriff credentials from the Narcotics Control Division of the Justice Department. That had been a long time ago. So Baker is an arc. Leaphorn's mind instantly sought the proper perspective for this new information. A narcotics agent was involving himself in the deaths of Ernesto Kata and Shorty Bowlegs. Why? And why had O'Malley tried to conceal this fact from local officers? Leaphorn glanced at Visconti. The Zuñi's face told Leaphorn nothing. Highsmith was slumped in his chair, fiddling with his state police uniform cap, his eyes invisible to Leaphorn. Orange Naranjo's stern old face was turned toward the window. Leaphorn watched him briefly turn to examine Baker, watch O'Malley glance back toward the window. Some vague hint of anger among the wrinkles suggested to Leaphorn that Naranjo, too, remembered who Baker was. O'Malley now looked at Leaphorn. It had been made clear earlier that the agent was not happy with Lieutenant Leaphorn. Leaphorn should not have prowled around in the Bowlegs Hogan after he had found Bowlegs' body. Leaphorn should have backed carefully away and not interfered with the work of the experts. "Baker and I'll head out to the Bowlegs' place now," O'Malley said, "and see if there's any prints or anything for the lab to work on." "We'd sure like to talk to George Bowlegs," he said to Leaphorn. Leaphorn put his carryall into gear and turned eastward, toward the commune which called itself Jason's Fleece. He had told O'Malley and Visconti about the note George Bowlegs left for Cecil. O'Malley hadn't been interested. Visconti had looked thoughtful, and finally had shaken his head and said that he'd heard Bowlegs was kind of a crazy kid. Leaphorn decided he would tell Suzanne of the note, and then talk to Ted Isaacs about it, hoping for some forgotten crumb of information which might point in the direction Bowlegs had taken. He was thinking that while Bowlegs was hunting his kachina, something was almost certainly hunting Bowlegs. Joe Leaphorn, who almost never hurried, was hurrying now. Wednesday, December 3, 12:15 p.m. A young man with peeling sunburn and blond hair tied in a bun was working with a portable welding torch in the commune school bus. "She's busy," he told Leaphorn. "What kind of business you have with her?" "Private kind. We're trying to find where the Bowlegs boy got off to." Behind hair and bun, the blanket covering the door of the hogan moved. A second later, Halsey pushed past the blanket and emerged. "You're a cop," Hair and Bun said. "I'm Navajo Fuzz." "Yetahi," Halsey said. "Sorry, but that kid ain't been back." "Well, then I'll just talk to Suzanne and see if she's remembered anything that might help." "She hasn't. No use you wasting your time." "Don't mind. Beats working." "What you fixing on the bus?" "Loose seat." "Be damned. You're welding it back instead of bolting it down." "Like to see how you're doing that." He moved toward the bus door. Hair and Bun stepped into the doorway. Leaphorn stopped. "I've got a one-track mind. The only thing I want to do is talk to Suzanne. But if she's off somewhere, I'll kill some time by looking around some." He looked at Hair and Bun. "Starting with this bus." "I think she's over by the windmill. I'll take you." The path wandered down into a narrow wash and then up toward the wall of a mesa. From just under the mesa, a windmill pumped a trickle of water into a sheep watering tank. A Russian olive beside the tank was festooned with drying shirts, jeans, and underwear. Suzanne was sitting in its shade, watching them approach. "Did you find him? Did George come home?" "No. I was hoping maybe you'd remember something that would help." She shook her head. I don't think he told me anything except what I could remember Monday." "Like I told you," Halsey said. Leaphorn ignored him. "You said George asked you if you knew anything about the Zuñi religion. Can you remember anything more about that part of the conversation?" Behind him, Halsey laughed. "Really, I can't." She was looking past him at Halsey. I'd help if I could." "Okay. Come on, Navajo policeman, let's go." Leaphorn turned. Halsey was standing in the path, looking amused and insolent. Leaphorn let his anger show in his voice. "I'm just saying this once. This girl and I are going to talk a while without you interrupting. We can talk here, or we can talk in the sheriff's office in Gallup. And if we go to Gallup, you and that illegal deer carcass will go along. Possession of an untagged mule deer carcass out of season will cost you maybe $300 and a little time in jail." "Okay," Halsey said, looking past Leaphorn at Suzanne. A long, baleful stare, turned on his heel and walked rapidly down the draw toward the commune. "But I still don't remember anything." Suzanne was looking after Halsey, her lower lip caught in her teeth. Leaphorn watched Halsey out of sight. "How could anybody possibly find him? There's no use chasing him. I've been thinking about what you told me about the cold weather." She looked at him defiantly. "I don't think I really believe George will freeze. If the foxes and coyotes and things like that don't freeze, I bet George wouldn't, and he'll get food. He killed that deer for us, you know. He's been keeping his family supplied with meat since he was just a little boy, and he knows everything about deer." "Like what?" She made a nervous gesture with her hands. Well, like deer have their eyes so far on the sides of their heads, they can see a lot better behind them than we can. But then he said the deer are mostly colorblind, and what was it he said? He said they see things like motion better than us." "They're very far-sighted." So I think if he gets hungry, he'll kill a deer. With what? Well, he didn't stop and get his daddy's rifle? Did he say he would? Suzanne's expression said she hadn't meant to tell him that. Well, I guess maybe he did. Did he tell you anything else about deer hunting? Well, lots of things. He was teaching Ernesto how to hunt, and Ernesto was teaching him the Zuñi way of hunting. They talked about hunting a lot. Frankly, I learned more about it than I need to know. She looks tired and thin, Leaphorn was thinking. What the hell is she doing here with this hard bunch? She's too young. Why don't people take care of their children? You said Ernesto was teaching him the Zuñi way to hunt. What was that? Well, there was a poem, a little song. You're supposed to sing it when you go after mule deer. I can just about remember, well, part of it. Dear, dear, strong male deer, I am the sound you hear running in your hoof prints. Sacred favors for you I bring. My arrow carries new life for you. She glanced sideways at Leaphorn, flushed. And then there's a prayer when the deer falls. You take his muzzle in your hands, and you put your face against his nostrils, and you inhale his breath, and you say, Thank you, Father. This day I have drunken in the sacred wind of your life. I think that's beautiful. She put her head down, her hands over her face. Ernesto was so happy, she said. She wasn't crying for Ernesto Cata, really, but for herself and for George Bowlegs and all the lost children. And now she was wiping her face with the back of her hand. I hope that helps, but I think you should wait for him to come home again. There isn't any home for George anymore. His dad is dead. Oh, my God. Poor George. Now he doesn't have anything. First he loses Ernesto, and now he loses his dad. He has a brother, an 11-year-old brother named Cecil. But until we can find George, Cecil doesn't have him. I didn't know he had a brother. It was as if she found it incredible, as if she suddenly didn't quite understand George Bowlegs. She stood up, put her hands in the pockets of her jeans, nervously took them out again. They were small hands, frail, grimy, with broken nails. If you don't really think George would freeze, then you want to find him because you think he killed Ernesto, is that it? Or somebody thinks he killed Ernesto? I guess somebody thinks he might have. Me, I think he can tell me enough so we'll know what happened and why it happened. I can't remember anything else, Suzanne said. She looked at her fingernails, then hid them in fists. She was much too thin, he thought, the skin stretched too tight over fragile bones. There's a problem, though, if I don't find him. The way Shorty Bowlegs died was somebody hit him over the head in his hogan last night. Whoever it was looking for something. Searched through everything in the hogan. Okay, think about it. Somebody kills the Cata boy. 2 days later, somebody kills George's dad and searched George's hogan. He looked at her. I'm nervous about George. 2 killings very much alike, and George is the only thing that connects the 2 of them. Oh, I didn't know his dad had been killed. I thought he just died. After George talked to you Monday, he went to their hogan, and George left a note. He told Cecil he had some business with a Kachina, and he was going to take care of it. Now, does that suggest anything to you? Suzanne was frowning. He was in a hurry. He wanted to get some venison, and when Hosey said no, George and I went out of the hogan. And then he asked me if the Council of the Gods forgave people for breaking taboos. I said I didn't know anything about it.
And then he said something about going to a dance hall or to a dance or something like that. Dance hall? It was something about a dance hall. I thought it sounded crazy. I'll do some asking around. Another thing. I don't think you should stay here anymore. I don't think it's safe. Why not? It's not much more than just a feeling, but George didn't have very many people close to him, and now 2 of them are dead. So that leaves you, and maybe Ted Isaacs. There was more to the feeling than that. There was the hostility of Halsey and Hair in the Bun, and there was Mr. Baker grinning in the background, smelling heroin in the wind. Have you warned Ted? Tell him to go back to Albuquerque. Tell him to get away from here. She looked distraught. I will. I'm telling you too. Get away from here. I can't. I don't have any place to go. Go back to your family. No family. My dad doesn't want me. Leaphorn digested this in silence. I guess here's my family. Halsey and the rest of them. That's my family. Leaphorn looked downstream. No one was in sight. How about Ted Isaacs? You like him. He likes you. You could look after one another until I can find George. No. Why not? No, because Ted is going to marry me someday. He can't marry me now. He's got to finish that project, and when he does, he'll be just about famous. And he'll have everything he's never had before. No more being dirt poor. No more being nobody. Okay, then, why can't you just go over there and stay at his camper? Dr. Reynolds wouldn't let him. I used to work over there a lot, but Dr. Reynolds talked to Ted about it. Her expression said she hoped Leaphorn would understand this. This is going to be a really important dig. He's going to make them rewrite all their books about the Stone Age man, and I might mess something up. So really, it's better if I stay away until it's finished. Isaacs told you all that before we had 2 killings. That sort of changes things. Well, go get your stuff, and we don't need to tell Halsey anything except that I'm taking you with me. Halsey won't like it, Suzanne said, but she followed him down the path. Wednesday, December 3rd, 3:48 p.m. Oh, God damn it, Ted Isaacs said. God damn it to hell! He slammed the shovel against the wheelbarrow and wiped his forehead against the back of his hairy forearm. He looked at Leaphorn, his expression belligerent. I don't see how she could really be in any danger. That's just sheer damn guesswork. I guess that's about right. Just a guess. Leaphorn squatted now, sinking to his heels. He found Isaac's reaction interesting. Not what he expected. Isaacs shook his head. George's dad got killed the same way Ernesto did, you say? Hit over the head? He shook his head again, then looked up at Leaphorn. Well, maybe it's those goddamn Indians. Some kind of feud between the Zuñis and the Navajos, maybe. His tone said he knew too much anthropology to believe it. Not likely. Leaphorn thought about it as he had before. Would Ernesto's family strike out in revenge, presuming young Bowlegs had killed their son and nephew? From what Leaphorn knew of the Zuñi way, such an act would be utterly unlikely. There hadn't been a homicide at Zuñi in modern times, and damn few, Leaphorn suspected, in the history of these people. As far as he could remember, everything in their religion and philosophy militated against violence. I don't think there's any revenge mixed up in this. You really think maybe there's some danger for Susie? I can't keep her here. Can't you put her someplace where she's safe? You're the law. You're supposed to keep people from getting hurt. I'm Navajo law, and that gal's white. Suzanne's just not my baby. Isaac stared at Leaphorn. I think she'll be all right. His face said he was trying hard to believe it. There's another thing, too. Just between us, it wouldn't surprise me any if there were some arrests out there one of these days soon. Narcotics? I thought maybe you wouldn't want her pulled in on that. I don't want her out there at all. But right now, I can't do a goddamn thing. Well, I didn't mean to take up so much of your time. I just had the wrong impression. He got up, started to walk away. Isaac's hand caught his elbow. Damn you! You think I don't care. You think I don't love her. I never had anything until Susie came here last summer. I never had a girl, clothes, no money. And then there was Susie, ragged and all. But you can tell what she is underneath. She's quality. And you know what? Right from the first, we liked one another, and by God, she was fascinated by me. She couldn't stay away, and I couldn't stand it if she did. But she did quit coming by here. Isaac sat down again on the wheelbarrow, slumped. That's something else you don't understand. He indicated the string-gridded dig site with a half-hearted wave. About what this dig here is. We're proving the Reynolds theory here. I've been getting everything we dreamed would ever get. He pulled a handful of envelopes from his bulging shirt pocket. I'm finding fulsome artifacts and parallel flaked stuff coming out of the same blanks. It's more of that petrified marsh bamboo, out of those formations south of Santa Fe. He spilled the contents of one of the envelopes into his palm and extended it. 3 large pieces of flint and a score of chips and flakes, all pink or salmon-colored. Leaphorn leaned forward to examine it, noticing that the hand was shaking. Look at the grain in this petrified wood. It's the same. Notice the discoloration in this piece. He indicated with his fingernail a streak of dark red. Notice how the same streak picks up in this one where he was trying to make the Folsom point. It's the very same damn piece of flint. You found them right together? Right in the same grid, Isaacs pointed to it. 17W, right there on the top of the ridge, right where a guy might be sitting watching for game down at the river while he chipped himself out some tools. And there was more of the same stuff in 2 of the adjoining grids. The guy must have broken one, dropped it right where he was sitting there, and went to work on the other one. And broke it, and dropped it too. And because he did, we make anthropology admit the traditional disappearing man story won't hold water anymore. Has Reynolds got the good news yet? Not until he comes back from Tucson this weekend. And that's what I was starting to explain. Reynolds is probably the one guy in the world who would give a graduate student a break like this. He gives away the glory. And all he expects in return is that you do him a scientific job. He looked at Leaphorn, his face bleak. By that, I mean a perfect job. Perfect. What do you mean? I mean, you don't make a single mistake. You don't screw up anything. Your records are exactly right. Nothing happens that would let any other scientist in any way cast any doubt on what you found. Like you don't let a couple of kids hang around your dig site. Like you don't let a girl hang around. You work from daylight until dark 7 days a week, and you don't let a damn thing distract you. I see. These rocks I got here mean the rest of my life. It means I get past the PhD committee with no sweat, and I get the degree. I have the reputation, and a book to write, and the status. It's the kind of thing that lasts you all of your life. All I was suggesting that you do was keep an eye on her until this business settles down. Isaac stared out toward the Zuñi buttes. I thought about it before, but Reynolds would figure that I wasn't the man for this dig. He'd pull me off and put somebody else on it. He may do it anyway because of those boys being here. And that would blow the whole ball game. He swung toward Leaphorn, his anger blazing again. Look, my folks were all East Tennessee white trash. Never been a one of them went to college. Just poor trash. This is the first chance an Isaac had to be anything but dirt. And when I get it made, I'm going to take whatever it costs, and I'm going to get these beaver teeth pushed back into my face. It's probably too late now to fix them, but by God, I'm going to try.
On his way back down the slope, Leaphorn thought about how the mind of dead Isaac sorted things out, so that Suzanne was on one side of the scale and everything else he wanted on the other. He shook his head and changed the theme. He skipped back 9,000 years to a naked hunter, laboriously chipping out a lance point, breaking it, calmly dropping it. Leaphorn had trouble with the second part of the scene. His imagination insisted on having his Folsom man shout an angry Stone Age curse and throw the offending flint down the slope. Way down the slope where no anthropologist would find it 90 centuries later. Wednesday, December 3, 5 p.m. Father Ingles of the Order of St. Francis was a wiry, tidy little man. Leaphorn found him sitting on the low wall surrounding the cemetery behind the St. Anthony's Mission Church. Leaphorn knew Ingles by reputation. He spoke Navajo, which was rare among white men, and had mastered its complex tonalities. Now he talked somberly. He had told Leaphorn about the family of Ernesto Cata, and now he told him about Shorty Bowlegs. Much of this Leaphorn already knew. After a while, enough time had passed to make his conversation absolutely comfortable. Leaphorn would ask the questions he had come to ask. Now he was content to listen. It was something Joe Leaphorn did very well.
This George now, he's an aggravating little devil,
Ingles was saying.
About half genius, half crazy. The kind of a boy that if you can make a Christian out of him, will make you a saint, full of mysticism.
Had he been coming to church here?
For a while. I guess you'd say he studied us, in competition with witchcraft and sorcery and the Zuñi religion.
You didn't get him baptized?
No. From what Ernesto told me, George started getting interested in the Zuñi way instead. Ernesto used to bring him in to talk to me. He'd ask me about the difference between the Zuñi Cochinas and our saints, things like that.
George told his little brother that he was going to find a Cochina, or maybe it was some Cochinas. He didn't seem to know exactly where to find them, but he said he'd be gone several days. Ingles frowned.
Find some Cochinas? He couldn't have meant the Cochina dolls, I guess.
I don't think so. I think he and Ernesto together had done something to offend the Cochinas, or thought they had, and George wanted to do something about it.
That sounds about like George. Did he say anything else?
He said if he didn't get his business done, I'd have to come back to Zuñi for Shalako. And he took one of Bowleg's horses. And a girl he knew told me he said something about going to a dance hall. Can you make any connection out of all that?
Well, you know what it might be? It might be he's trying to find Kothluwalawa.
Kothluwalawa? Where's that?
It's part of the migration mythology. The Zuñis had completed their emergence up through the 4 underworlds and had started their great journey hunting for the middle place of the universe. Some children were carried across the Zuñi River by the older people. There was sort of a panic, and the children were dropped. As they were washed downstream, instead of drowning, they turned into water animals, and they swam downstream to this place we're talking about. According to mythology, it's a lake. Once they got there, the children changed into Cochinas. They formed the Council of the Gods, the rain god of the north, the rain god of the south, the little fire god, and the rest of them. Originally 100 or so, I think, but they're not gods. The Zuñi have only one god, Awan Awalona, who is the creator. But the Kachinas are different. Maybe you could call them ancestor spirits. Their attitude toward humans is friendly, fatherly. They bring blessings. I'd heard some of that. So this Kathlawalwa, where Bowleg said he was going, is a lake somewhere down the Zuñi Wash. Well, it's not that simple. I have 4 books about the Zuñis in my office, and they have it located in 4 different places. And I've heard a couple of other places, most often a little natural lake just across the Arizona border. Leaphorn said nothing. What made me think of Kathlawalwa was that business of the dance hall. If you translate that word to English, it means something like dance hall of the dead. They sat there, Navajo policeman and Franciscan missionary. In the west, the sky had turned garish with sunset. Leaphorn thought about what Inglis had said. This Kathlawalwa might be the word Cecil remembered that started with a K. I think what's important is not where this Zuñi heaven is located. What's important is where George thinks it's located. Yes, same thought occurred to me. Inglis thought about it. I bet it would be the little lake just across the border. It's used a lot for religious purposes. If George was asking around about it, that's where he'd most likely be told it was located. But now I have a question for you. Do you think he killed Ernesto and his own father, too? Leaphorn thought about the answer. He could have killed Kata, and he could have killed Shorty. But there doesn't seem to be any reason. I guess that's the trouble. Nobody seems to have a reason. To kill Ernesto? He was a good kid. A lot of friends. No enemies that I know of. Cecil Bowlegs told me that Ernesto and George had stolen something. It was supposed to have been something from that anthropological dig north of Corn Mountain. Ernesto was a Catholic. He was an altar boy. If he stole something, he knew he had to give it back before he could make a good confession. Is that right? Ingles was grinning at him. What you were saying is, you're his confessor. Did he confess anything to you that would explain why somebody killed him? That's what you're asking me. But you know I can't reveal what I'm told in the confessional. But Kata's dead now. Maybe it would help George Bowlegs. I'm thinking about it. I've been a priest almost 40 years, and it never came up before. Just negative information might help. Just knowing that he didn't steal anything important. Cecil Bowlegs told me it was some arrowheads, but it wasn't. They told me they weren't missing any artifacts. In fact, they weren't missing anything. Ingles sat silently, his teeth worrying his lower lip, his mind worrying the problem. To be a mortal sin, the offense has to be serious. What you're describing would have been a very minor imperfection. Something a boy would do. Something a boy with a less scrupulous conscience than Ernesto wouldn't even think of confessing. I wonder why, then, he wanted to confess it. Did he think it was important? No, not really. It was Saturday afternoon. I was hearing confessions. Ernesto wanted to talk to me very privately about something else. So he got in line, and then, since he was in the confessional anyway, I heard his confession and gave him absolution. Last Saturday? The day before he was killed? Yes, last Saturday. I'm getting cold. Let's go in. To the heavy wooden door, Ingles bowed in the direction of the altar and pointed Leaphorn toward the back pew. I don't know what I've said that's helpful. Would it help any if you told me what Kato wanted to talk to you about? I mean, before he confessed his sins. Ingles chuckled. I doubt it. It was hardly the material for murder. But could you tell me what it was? I I don't think I'd tell a Zuñi, but, well, you're a Navajo.
English smiled.
Ernesto thought maybe he had violated a Zuñi taboo. But he wasn't sure, and he was nervous about it, and he just wanted to talk to a friend about it.
What taboo?
Children, anyone not yet old enough to be initiated into the Zuñi religion society, aren't supposed to be told about the personifiers. According to legend, the Council of the Gods would come back to the village each year. They'd bring rain, crops, blessings of all sorts. But it always happened that some of the Zuñis would follow them when they left to return to the dance hall of the dead. And when you followed, you died. The Kachinas didn't want it to keep happening, so they told the Zuñis that they would come no more. Instead, the Zuñis should make sacred masks representing them, and valuable men of the kivas and the various fetish societies would be selected to impersonate various spirits. The Kachinas would come only in spirit. They would be visible, I've been told, to certain sorcerers, but anyone else who saw them would die. Now, this arrangement between the Kachinas and the Zuñis was a secret arrangement. Only those initiated into the religion were to know of it. The children were not to be told.
Leaphorn's eyes were studying the murals that spread down the walls of the mission. Against the blank white plaster were the dancing gods of the Zuñis, most of them man-sized and man-like, except for the grotesque masks, which gave them heads like monstrous birds. Only one was smaller, a figure of black spotted with red, and one was much larger, the giant figure of the Shalico.
That's what Ernesto was worried about. He told George that he would be the personifier of Shulawitsi, and he was worrying about whether that had broken the taboo. There.
The priest pointed at the small black figure leading the procession of the Kachinas down the wall.
The little black one in the spotted mask is Shulawitsi, the little fire god. He's always impersonated by a boy.
Telling George about it, had that violated the taboo?
I don't know, really. George would have been initiated 2 or 3 years ago if he was a Zuñi, so he wasn't a child in the way the myth means. But on the other hand, he hadn't been formally initiated into the cult secrets. The way it's explained in the myth, this Zuñi boy tells the little children to spoil deliberately the ceremonial for them because he's angry. The Council of the Gods send the Salamobia to punish the boy.
Inglis pointed to the 4th Kachina in the mural, a muscular figure armed with a whip of yucca, its beaked head surmounted by a pointed plume of feathers, its eyes ferocious. Leaphorn's eyes had lingered on it earlier, caught by something familiar. Now he knew what it was. This was the same beaked mask he had seen 2 nights earlier, reflecting the moonlight behind the hogan at Jason's fleece. What was the punishment?
The Salamobia chopped off his head with a machete right in the plaza out here and played football with it.
Do you know how Ernesto was killed? Ingles looked surprised.
I presumed he'd been knifed.
Someone chopped him across the neck with a machete. They almost cut his head off. Thursday, December 4, 10:30 a.m. Leaphorn had been up since dawn, making his 3rd visit to the Bowlegs Hogan. Around the brush corral he had examined the hoofprints of the horse George Bowlegs had taken, memorizing the nature of the horseshoes and every split and crack in the hooves. The body of Shorty Bowlegs was gone now. The livestock was gone too, but the worldly goods of Shorty Bowlegs remained inside, made untouchable to Navajos by ghost sickness. The disarray had been increased by a 3rd search, this one by the Federals. Leaphorn stood at the doorway and thoughtfully inspected the jumble. Something held him here, a feeling that he was forgetting something or overlooking something, leaving something undone. But whatever it was, it eluded him now.
Following the directions Father Inglis had given him, Leaphorn picked up the gravel road that led to the Zuñi tribal sawmill back in the Cibola National Forest, continued on it to the Fence Lake Road, turned northward past the prehistoric yellow house ruins to New Mexico 53. Now, for the first time, there was something to work on, a direction. George had left his family hogan with a horse Monday night. The distance to the lake would be maybe 50 miles. If George had taken the most direct route, he would angle across the Zuñi reservation. Leaphorn's plan was simple. He would drive as close as he could to the location of the lake, and then begin looking for Bowleg's tracks. He felt good about it, anticipating the pleasure of some solid accomplishment after 3 days of frustrations. The narrow asphalt narrowed even more. Its gravel shoulders turned to weeds, and New Mexico 53 abruptly became Arizona 61 at the border. At the intersection with U.S. Highway 666, Leaphorn saw Suzanne. She was standing north of the junction, looking small and cold and frail. Leaphorn hesitated. He didn't want company today. He had looked forward to a day alone to restore the spirit. On the other hand, he was curious, and he found himself remarkably fond of this girl. He didn't want her to simply disappear. He pulled the carryall off the pavement and stopped beside her. "Where are you going?" "North, up to Interstate 40. She shook her head. "I guess I don't really know exactly." "I think I know how to find George. If you've got time, you could help." "Oh, I couldn't help." "You're his friend. He's almost certain to see me before I see him, and he'll hide. But if he sees you, he'll know it's all right." "Oh, I wish I was sure it was all right myself." But when he opened the door, she got into the cab beside him. He started southward down 666. Suzanne said nothing. "So why did you change your mind about staying at the commune?" "Halsey changed it for me. He said I was attracting too much police." She looked out of the window away from him. "I was right about Ted, too, wasn't I? There's just no way he could possibly do it. This is Ted's really big hope. He's going to be famous after this. You know, he's never been nothing but poor, him and his old family, and this is Ted's chance. He's never had a thing." It sounded, Leaphorn thought, as if Suzanne was trying to persuade both of them. Leaphorn found the ranch gate Father Inglis had described about 1.5 miles up the slope from Zuñi Wash. He drove very slowly, keeping his wheels off the dirt track to cut the risk of raising dust. Father Inglis had said the lake was 5 or 6 miles in from the highway and below the mesa. Finding it would be relatively easy in a country where deer, antelope, and cattle trails would lead to any standing water. Leaphorn pulled the carryall into a shallow arroyo and parked it amid a tangle of junipers. The lake proved to be less than 1 mile away. Leaphorn stood among the rocks on the ridge above it and examined it carefully through his binoculars. Nothing moved anywhere around the cracked mud shore. "I don't think he'd come here. Why would he? Can you think of any reason?" "All I know about George is what people tell me. I hear he's sort of crazy. I hear he wants to become a member of the Zuñi tribe. Now I also hear Ernesto was his best friend, and that Ernesto was afraid he had broken a taboo by telling George more than you're supposed to tell the uninitiated about the Zuñi religion." Leaphorn paused, thinking about how it might have happened. "Now, let's say George left a bicycle where he was supposed to meet Ernesto, and he wanders off somewhere. When he gets back, the bicycle is gone, and so is Ernesto. That's natural enough. He thinks Ernesto didn't wait and he missed him. But he also notices that great puddle of blood. It would have scared him. The next day he comes to school looking for Ernesto, and he finds out Ernesto is missing. That's exactly the way it happened. Let's say he decides the Kachinas have punished Ernesto for the broken taboo. Maybe he wants to come here to ask the Council of the Gods to absolve him of any of the blame. Or maybe he came because here's where Ernesto's spirit will be coming to join the ancestors. Even as Leaphorn told it, it sounded unlikely. If he plans to be here when Ernesto's spirit arrives, we have a good chance of catching up with him. That would be sometime tomorrow. What do you mean? It takes 5 days' travel after death for the spirit to reach the dance hall of the dead. He joins the council of the gods and becomes a Kachina. Around the lake, Leaphorn found antelope tracks, some old moccasin imprints in the dried mud, and the various traces left by coyotes and porcupines and red fox. The moccasin marks eliminated any doubt that this place had some religious significance. Except for ritual events, Zuñis were no more likely to be wearing moccasins than were Navajos or FBI agents. He worked his way away from the lake, searching in an expanding circle along game trails and sandy drainage bottoms. Suzanne followed, asking a few questions at first, then falling silent. After several hours, he found clear and unmistakable the shape of the left forefoot of George's horse. It was in the bare earth where the bulk of a rabbit bush shielded it from the wind. And then what? Leaphorn examined the ground around the bush, picking up traces of hoof tracks. The short distance he scouted suggested that George had ridden up this ridge from the northeast, and then had ridden some 30 yards along the ridge and away toward the southeast. He had found the lake, and then he had ridden away. "You're sure about him not taking food from the commune?" "I'm sure." "The boy's hungry, and he's brought along his deer rifle, so I guess he'd go deer hunting." There were no deer tracks here. The herds would still be back on the plateau, not yet driven down to low ground by snow and cold. If George was smart, he'd head for the plateau, find a place with shelter, get over a deer trail, and have meat to eat while he waited for whatever he waited for. And because George Bowlegs knew how to find deer, Leaphorn knew how to find Bowlegs. Thursday, December 4, 2:17 p.m. They found the tracks of George's horse on the saddleback slope, about where Leaphorn expected to find them. From the mesa top above them there came the raucous cry of a pinyon jay. Leaphorn listened, heard nothing else. The breeze was dead now. Nothing moved. They climbed up the saddle over the tip of the mesa, moved slowly and cautiously as Leaphorn went about his work. Within an hour he had accumulated most of the information he needed. In this season, this end of the mesa was the grazing territory for a herd of perhaps 20 mule deer. They watered at a seep under the rimrock and had 2 regular sleeping places. Within 2 hours he had a fair idea of the pattern the herd followed in its dawn, twilight, and nocturnal feedings. From what you tell me about George, he's going to know all this. The ravens led them to the spot. The guard bird rose, cawing and alert. A dozen feeders flapped skyward in his wake, noisy with alarm, and down the slope they found the small clearing where George had shot his deer. The animal, a small 2-year-old buck, still lay beside the trail in the shadow of an outcropping of boulders. Leaphorn stood on one of the boulders, surveying the scene and feeling good about it. For the first time since he had heard of George Bowlegs, something seemed to be working out with that rational harmony Leaphorn's orderly soul demanded. "From here we pick up his tracks and—" Leaphorn's expression deteriorated into a puzzled frown. He swung himself down off the boulders and squatted beside the carcass. It was stiff, a fat young buck, shot just behind the left shoulder, a perfect shot for an instant kill. George had then rolled the buck on its back, removed the scent glands from its rear legs, tied off the anal vent, opened the chest cavity and the abdomen with a neat and precise incision. He had rolled out the entrails, and then he had cut a long strip of hide and tied it to the buck's front ankles, presumably in preparation for hoisting the carcass from a tree limb to let it drain and cool away from ground rodents. But the carcass still lay there. Leaphorn scowled at it. He could have understood if George had simply sliced himself a substantial portion of venison and let the carcass lie. It would have gone against the grain as Navajo and hunter to waste the meat. But if he had been in a hurry, George might have done it. Leaphorn rocked back on his heels and tried to recreate it. The boy carefully scouting the herd, picking the deer he wanted, firing the single precise shot, then bleeding his kill, dressing the carcass, and then, with the job almost done, walking away and leaving the meat to spoil without even cutting himself a steak to roast. Is something wrong? Look around and see if you can find the empty rifle shell. What would it look like? Brass, smaller than a fountain pen cap. He poked through the entrails. The heart was missing, and the liver, and the gallbladder. The bitter gall was useful to a Navajo only for ceremonial purposes, for medicine to fend off witches. Leaphorn tried to remember if the gall of deer had any ritual use for the Zuñis. Something about a hunting fetish, he thought. He confirmed that George had taken no meat. At one point an incision had been made and some fat cut out. Why would George want tallow? Leaphorn rose from the crouch, noticing that his muscles were tired. Deer tracks were everywhere. George had walked here. The sign of his boots was plain over the hoof marks. So was the print of the moccasin. Leaphorn stared at this track, a soft, medium-sized, foot-shaped impression. And then his hand fumbled at the flap of his pistol holster as the implication of what he was seeing became clear. Someone had followed George here. Mind and memory fit pieces together. Leaphorn saw Cecil's battered tin lunchbox with keepsakes disordered by a searching hand. He heard Cecil's voice saying that the note from George had been left in the box. In that instant, Leaphorn knew what he had been overlooking for 36 hours. The note was missing from the box because the man who killed Shorty Bowlegs had found it, and from it had calculated where George had gone, and had relentlessly tracked him to this spot. Leaphorn cursed himself vehemently in Navajo. How could he have been so stupid? He glanced at the carcass. This person must have arrived as George was dressing the deer, which explained why George had abandoned the job unfinished. So where was George now? Had the man killed him and hidden the body? Here it is! Suzanne's voice was behind him. She was holding up an empty cartridge between thumb and forefinger. Let's see it. Suzanne dropped into his palm an empty .30-30 shell, its copper percussion cap dented, its mouth still smelling faintly of burned powder. It was at the base of the big rock, Suzanne said. Was it from George's gun? It was from George's rifle. Now see if you can find another one. Suzanne's face made a question. He didn't answer it. Instead, he began the tedious job of finding how George had left this spot. It took 15 minutes to sort out the footprints. Leaphorn felt tremendous relief. George had left under his own power, walking directly away from the carcass and back around the boulder. There he had turned, crouched with his weight on the balls of his feet, facing back into the clearing. From there the footprints led up the slope into heavier timber. Leaphorn sat on the trunk of a fallen ponderosa and considered alternatives. He could continue trying to follow George's tracks, or he could wait and try to catch him at the lake tomorrow, or he could give up and go home. The odds of finding George now that he had been frightened looked dismal. George Bowlegs, Leaphorn decided, would still, right now, be on this mesa, waiting for whatever he was waiting for at the dance hall of the dead. But would the man who hunted him still be here? Leaphorn considered this. The man would have known he had flushed his bird. So what would the man who wore moccasins do? Leaphorn thought of the bloody head of Shorty Bowlegs, a ransacked Hogan. He doubted if the man would give up. He would stay in a likely place with a long view and wait for the boy to make a move. We've got a little bit of light left. I think we'll go back toward that saddle where we climbed up here. That was George's way up, and it's probably his way down. We'll find a place to get some rest somewhere near there. In the morning, we'll be in a position to watch for him. On the rim rock above the saddle, Leaphorn stopped again. He got out his binoculars and spent 5 minutes examining the landscape. Beyond the saddle, south of the cliff on which Leaphorn stood, a shelf of land extended. The timber there was thick. He had noticed it before, spotting it as ideal deer cover. And there were escape routes. The way down was steep but not impossible. Leaphorn studied the site through the binoculars. It would be attractive to George for the same reason it would appeal to deer. It offered security without being a trap. At the head of the saddle, they crossed the game trail which led down it. "There's our tracks," Suzanne said. "Your boots and my tennies. And there's George's horse's hoofprint that we saw going up." "Yeah. And here's one of those moccasin tracks. He stepped on your footprint." Leaphorn squatted beside the track. The moccasin, going down the trail, had partially erased the heel mark Leaphorn had left that afternoon on the way up. He had not explained to her who must have left the prints at the carcass of the deer. There hadn't been any reason to frighten her. Now maybe he should tell her. The man who had been stalking George yesterday might now be stalking them. At least he knew they were on the mesa. Had the man found them? Was he watching them now? He decided to tell Suzanne about the moccasin tracks. He would do it while they were eating. She should know. "Susie, keep your eyes open. I'm going down here just a little ways and see if I can see anything." He took, as it turned out, exactly 3 steps. Thursday, December 4, 6:08 p.m. The pain was like being struck by a hammer. Leaphorn staggered a step backward. He gasped for air. Conscious simultaneously of the loud double crack of the shot, of the great knot of pain in his abdomen, of the stink of burned powder. Behind him he heard Suzanne scream. His left hand had moved without his willing it to move to his stomach. It had found, projecting from his shirt just above his navel, a tube of metal. Leaphorn stared down at it, incredulous at first, and then trying to understand what he was seeing. With a motion born of revulsion, Leaphorn jerked the cylinder away from his stomach. He flinched at the freshened pain. A steel hypodermic needle, half the diameter of a soda straw, jutted an inch from the front of the cylinder, red now with Leaphorn's blood. The cylinder was hot and stank of cordite. He stared at it without understanding. And then he knew what had stuck him. It was a hypodermic dart for stunning animals used by zoos, veterinarians, and animal biologists. He took 6 quick steps down the trail to the rocks. Carefully wedged into a crevasse screened with dead leaves was a black carbon dioxide pellet gun with a second tube attached to its top. A copper wire was tied to the trigger mechanism. Suzanne was beside him now, looking at the cylinder. "What is it?" "I tripped some sort of booby trap. It's what you shoot wild animals with when you want to capture them without killing them." Leaphorn unbuttoned his shirt and pulled apart the cloth enough to examine the wound. The puncture hole in the dark skin looked incredibly small. Only a little blood seeped from it. Suzanne's eyes were enormous. "What will it do to you?" By now Leaphorn was asking himself the same question. He looked around him almost frantically. He ran down the path and cut back toward the cliff. "There," he said, pointing. "We'll get into that depression in the wall." "What are—" "Don't talk. There isn't time." He handed her his pistol. "I'm going to be out of it in a minute, so listen. Here's how this thing works." He showed her how to aim, how the revolver fired, the dozen spare cartridges in his belt, and how to reload. "Whoever set that trap either heard it fire, or he's going to come around and check, and he'll find us. When he comes, shoot him." He felt a wave of nausea and raised his hand to rub his forehead. It took a concentrated effort of will to control the hand. Try to kill him." Leaphorn's voice sounded thick in his ears now, and fierce with rage. If you don't keep him away, I think he'll kill us. It was hard now to control his tongue. And if I die, try to slip away in the dark. Find the highway. Talking now was an immense effort. His legs were numb. He wanted to move his feet. The message left his brain, but nothing happened. His tongue would no longer rise from his teeth to form a sound. When he could no longer talk, when he could do nothing, panic arrived. A frantic dream of suffocation, of drowning helplessly in his own fluids. He fought it down grimly, controlling his mind. He could no longer control his body. The panic left as quickly as it had come, left him calm, studying the effects of the drug. It seemed now to have included an almost total paralysis of all voluntary muscles without affecting involuntary actions, the blink of the eyes, the rhythmic expansion-contraction of the lungs. Leaphorn considered all this with an odd sort of detachment. His mind still seemed clear, unusually clear, in fact, and his hearing was excellent. He simply could not move. How long would the paralysis last? Several hours, he thought. And how many is several? Suzanne had stopped trying to talk to him, recognizing that he could not respond. She sat beside him, her back to the dark. He noticed with mild surprise that he could hear Suzanne breathing. He could hear incredibly well. Somewhere on the cliff above, a night bird was moving. At some immense distance on the mesa, a coyote yipped twice and then sang its warbling song. And somewhere to his front, somewhere behind the screen of rabbit brush and juniper on this rocky hill, there were the footsteps of a human. They were slow footsteps, carefully placed, the footsteps of a hunter stalking. And then Suzanne was speaking to him. Her whisper thundered around his head, the words indescribably slow. "Mr. Leaphorn, can you hear me? I think there is something out there." Her hand was on his chest, her face close to his, fear in her eyes, and more words. "Mr. Leaphorn, please don't die." "I won't," Leaphorn thought. "I will never die." But perhaps he would die. He could hear the footsteps clearly. The hunter now stood behind the tangle of chamisa and juniper, which the moonlight had turned from gray to silver. Now the hunter moved again, closer. He stopped behind the juniper with a broken limb. There, now in the darkness, eluded by the moonlight, was the face of whatever it was that made these creaking footfalls. It was a bird. It was much larger than any physical bird. Its eyes stared, round and bland and dead, from a face that was black and yellow and blue. The eye sockets were empty, he saw. The bird's skull was hollow, and being hollow, must be dead. Yet it moved. The rampant plume of feathers at its summit bristled with movement, and its rigid beak angled outward past a juniper limb, reflecting the moonlight. Beside him, Suzanne sucked in her breath and made a strangled sound. Leaphorn's pistol rose in her hand. A great flash of light and a blast of sound. Now there was a smell of exploded powder. The echo rolled away around the mesa walls. Finally, it melded into the other night sounds and faded away. The bird was gone now. Leaphorn could hear only the sound of crying. Leaphorn lost himself, falling into a glittering psychedelic dream in which the cold moon pulsed in an inky void, and a hunter sat naked on a ridge, working with infinite patience, chipping out lance points from pink ice, breaking them, dropping the broken parts onto the earth beside him, taking defeat after defeat without a show of anger. He was cold. His hands were freezing. He managed some sort of sound, something between a sigh and a grunt. "You're all right," Suzanne's voice whispered at his ear. I think everything is going to be all right. The moon had moved now, climbing up the sky and edging southward. The landscape glittered gray and silver with moonlight. Nothing moved. His hearing still seemed to be unusually acute. From far, far away he heard the song of a coyote again, so dim by distance that it seemed to drift down from the stars. The grotesque bird he had seen in his hallucination, the bird that had vanished after Suzanne fired at it, must have been a Kachina mask. Leaphorn thought about it. He recognized the mask, the bristling black ruff round the neck, the fierce plume of eagle feathers atop the head, the long tubular beak. He had seen the mask before, in the moonlight behind the hogan at Jason's Fleece, and painted in the mural in the Zuñi mission. It was the Salamobia, the warrior who carried a whip-like sword of tight-woven yucca. He tried to summon from his memory what he knew of this Kachina. There were 2 of them at Shalako ceremonials, dancing attendance on the other members of the Council of the Gods. But each of the 6 Zuñi kivas was represented by 1, so the total must be 6. So 6 such masks must exist. The genuine masks would be guarded, but anyone could make a counterfeit. The dart had been intended for George, apparently not meant to kill him, at least not immediately. Why not? Was it because this person, like Leaphorn, wanted to talk to the boy? And why had George taken the gall from the deer? And why take the fat from under the deerskin? There was something Leaphorn should remember about that. Something to do with Zuñi hunting procedures. He forced himself to concentrate. He could see Rounder, his Zuñi roommates, slightly drunk, his 2 hands framing the beer mug on the table, and then showing them how the Zuñi hunter breathed in the animal's last breath, and the prayer, and the details of how the deer must be dressed, and of the making of the ball of deer fat, and gall and blood from the heart, and hair from the proper places, and some fetish offerings to be buried when the deer had fallen. Then the nightmare was on him again, worse than before. The sky filled with the chindi of the dead. They wore deerskin masks, and their great beaks clacked, and there was a face against his, breathing his breath, taking the wind of his life as it left his nostrils. And next, the hand of Suzanne on his face, her voice in his ear. "Mr. Leaphorn, it's all right. Don't be afraid." There was a cold gray light against the eastern horizon now. Leaphorn's mind told his shoulder muscles to huddle against the cold, and they did huddle, and his hand, told to rub his icy shoulder, rubbed it. Leaphorn was suddenly wide awake, the hallucinations of memory. Leaphorn tried his legs. They too moved to command. He felt a fierce joy. He was alive. He was sane. It wasn't until after sunrise that Leaphorn had full control of all his muscles. His stomach bore a swollen red bruise where the dart had struck and fired its charge. He felt weak and sick. He had planned to head for the lake, to try to reach it by sunrise. The sunrise of the 5th day, when Ernesto Cata's spirit would arrive to join the Council of the Gods. But while he could walk a little, he couldn't walk straight. So instead they waited by the saddle on the slight chance that George Bowlegs would be passing by. George did not appear. Leaphorn thought about a diversity of things. About what Ernesto Cata had told Father Ingles, about the odd way in which George Bowlegs had behaved, about Zuñi hunting ritual, about Ted Isaac's speculation on how a Stone Age hunter had made his lance points, and about Halsey. He thought about why whoever had set the trap for George Bowlegs had used a hypodermic gun instead of a shotgun, and of other matters. He told Suzanne they would return to the deer carcass, and then head back for the truck. "We'll cut off enough venison for some breakfast," Leaphorn said. They did that. And after he made a fire on which to roast it, he examined the ground around the carcass. He found a place where a small hole had been cut into the earth beside the carcass. Buried in it was a still, soft ball of clay, blood, tallow, gall, and deer hair. The fetish offering Rounder had described for the fallen animal. Leaphorn pulled it apart carefully. Inside the ball he found the turquoise bead, the broken tip of a stone lance point, and a small bit of abalone shell. Friday, December 5, 2 p.m. FBI agent John O'Malley made a tent out of his hands and looked past Leaphorn. "To sum it up," he said, "we still don't know where to put our hands on George Bowlegs. I think the kid knows something about why Kata and Shorty Bowlegs were killed. And I think he can tell us something about that commune." The eye shifted away and the smile turned off. "We really wanted to talk to him today." Leaphorn said absolutely nothing. O'Malley folded the finger tent. The grin went away. He stood up. "It might help if you'd fill me in on what you've been learning." "I gather someone recognized Baker as a narcotics agent," O'Malley said. "He is." The silence stretched. That was all. Leaphorn realized with incredulous anger that this was all O'Malley was going to tell him. "Okay, then you think the commune is a cover for a narcotics drop, heroin or what have you, and the killings were done to protect it." O'Malley said nothing. "Is that right?" O'Malley hesitated. "It's pretty obvious." "Can I guess that Baker was working on this before the killings?" O'Malley grinned again. "I'd say you could guess that." "What have you got?" The grin faded. "I can tell you that we'd really like to talk to George today." "Why today?" "Tomorrow's this big Zuñi Shalago ceremonial. It would be a good cover for somebody to make a pickup." "Anybody in particular?" There was another pause while O'Malley thought about it. He unzipped the briefcase on his desk and pulled out a sheaf of photographs. Leaphorn recognized Halsey in a photograph that seemed to have been taken on a college campus, and Hare and Bunn in a police mug photo. There were 5 others he didn't recognize, including a young man with an Indian face in a paratroop uniform. Leaphorn picked up this photograph and examined it. "If you see any of these men around tomorrow, I want to know about it," O'Malley said. "This guy is Zuñi?" "Yeah. He got the habit in Vietnam. He's been involved in dealing some since he got back." Leaphorn put the photograph on the desk. "That's the motive for the killings, then? Keeping a narcotics operation covered up?" "You got enough to be sure of that?" "That's right. We're sure." "Okay, so I'll just stick to finding George for you." Pasquante listened impassively while Leaphorn told him about seeing the Kachina at the commune, about the ambition of George Bowlegs to become a Zuñi, about the note the boy had left for his brother, and about what happened on the mesa. The Zuñi interrupted only once. He asked Leaphorn to describe the mask. "It had a thick ruff of feathers around the neck," Leaphorn said. "Black. Probably crow or raven feathers. Had a beak maybe 6 inches long and round like a broom handle. And the mask was rounded on top with a sort of wand of feathers pointing quills forward as a topknot. Then there was a design drawn on the cheek. I think it was a Salamobia mask." "What color was the face?" "The face? It was black." Pasquante looked old. Leaphorn hadn't noticed that before. "Mr. Leaphorn, I thank you for telling me this." "Is there anything you can tell me?" Pasquante thought about it. "I can tell you that the Salamobia you saw was not genuine. Black is the color of the mole kiva. The mask is safe. It's always safe, so are the other masks. You can be sure of that." "Then could someone have taken another mask?" Pasquante considered this. his fingers folded and unfolded on a desk. "There are bad among us. Some of us drink and have learned the white man's greed and aren't worth anything. But I don't think a Zuñi would take the mask of his family and use it like this." The two men looked at each other silently. What Leaphorn described had been a hideous desecration. "One more thing. I think George Bowlegs is wild to become a Zuñi. I think he will come to Shalako. I think it would be good if your people watch for him." "We will." And the man who wore the mask, he was smart enough to figure out where to look for George. He will be smart enough to figure it out again. "We will watch for that man." Pasquante's voice caused Leaphorn to remember something that Rounder had told him years ago. In Zuñi mythology, the penalty for sacrilege is death. Saturday, December 6, 4:19 p.m. Lieutenant Joseph Leaphorn spent the afternoon on the ridge that overlooks the village of Zuñi from the south. The view was ideal for his purpose. One or the other of these two roads below would provide the most direct route from the mesa where George Bowlegs had killed his deer to the Shalako ceremonials in Zuñi village. Leaphorn could think of no other activity that offered better odds than sitting here. It also offered him a chance to think. The swollen bruise on his abdomen reminded him of the first puzzle. Why had the trap been set to catch George Bowlegs, but not to kill him? Kata and Shorty Bowlegs had been cut down without hesitation. Why not George? Already the wide shoulders of State Road 53 were cluttered with cars and campers and pickups. The Zuñi people had come home from wherever they had wandered, drawn back for this great coming home of their ancestor spirits. And with them came the curious, the tourists, dilettante Indian lovers, anthropologists, students, hippies, other Indians. Among the crowd would be the Zuñi's brothers of the Pueblos, people from Acoma, Laguna, Zia, Hopi, Isleta, Santo Domingo. Men who were priests of their own kivas, themselves connoisseurs of the metaphysics of nature, men with their own dancing gods, who came to share in the ancient magic of their cousins, and of course the Navajos. In from the lonely Hogans with wives and children, taller, raw-boned, wearing their levis, looking on with a mixture of awe for great medicine made by these callers of the clouds, and the countryman's contempt for the dweller of towns. Leaphorn sighed. Normally, Zuñi village held perhaps 3,500 of the 4,500 Zuñis. Tonight, 7,000 or 8,000 people would be crowded here. It would be, as O'Malley had said, the one time a stranger come to pay money or collect heroin would be least likely to be noticed. There was a stir of activity in the village now, people gathering on the street that fronted along Zuñi Wash. Leaphorn watched. Through his powerful Navy surplus binoculars, he saw the figure of a boy crossing the footbridge. The boy wore a hood surmounted by a single feather. Mask and body were black, spotted with dots of red, blue, yellow, and white. The little fire god, Leaphorn knew, Shulawitsi. Ernesto Kata was dead, but the little fire god lived. The Badger clan had provided another of its sons to personify this eternal spirit. The afternoon wore on. Leaphorn watched the roads and pursued his thoughts. More activity in the village now. The sound of drums and flutes barely audible on the cold air. This would be the arrival of the Council of the Gods, the fire god with a smoking cedar branch, then the rain god of the north. And behind him Hututu, who brought the rains from the south. And two Salamobias, the same fierce-beaked faces that Leaphorn remembered from his nightmare. In each hand they carried a heavy, pointed whip-wand of yucca blades. The crowd kept a respectful distance. The procession disappeared into the village. Leaphorn reached into his pocket and extracted a turquoise bead the abalone shell, and the broken flint lance tip. All were items to which both Navajo and Zuñi would attach ritual significance. As a boy, he used to hunt for these relics. He'd find them turned up in arroyo bottoms, uncovered on hillsides and exposed among the clumps of buffalo grass. And perhaps he and Kata had stolen it from the dig site, and it had, despite the certainty of Reynolds and Isaacs, somehow not been missed. That seemed unlikely, however. It was too fine a sample of Stone Age workmanship, or perhaps. The fragment of flint in Leaphorn's palm became a sort of keystone. Around it, the pieces of the puzzle of why Ernesto Kata had to die fell exactly into place. Suddenly, Leaphorn knew why the trap set for George Bowlegs had not been a lethal trap, and what had happened in the hogan of Shorty Bowlegs, and why what George Bowlegs had told his brother about petty theft had been contradicted by Reynolds and Isaacs. He knew now why 2 murders had been committed, and he knew he could not prove it, could probably never prove it. Leaphorn pushed himself to his feet, brushed the sand from his uniform, and began walking down the slope toward Zuñi village. The snow had begun. Heavy, wet, life-giving snow. Once again, the Shalako had called the clouds and brought the water blessing to their people. One corner of Leaphorn's mind appreciated the harmony of this. Another urged him to hurry. Yesterday, the killer had needed George Bowlegs alive, but if George Bowlegs came to Shalako, George Bowlegs would have to die. Sunday, December 7, 2:07 p.m. By 1 a.m., Leaphorn had decided he wasn't likely to find George Bowlegs. He had prowled the village tirelessly, watching and studying faces, always looking for the face he had memorized from the Zuñi school yearbook. Once he had seen Pasquante. Leaphorn had caught the Zuñi's attention, called him out into the darkness, told him quickly and briefly his conclusions about who had killed Ernesto Kata. Pasquante had listened silently, commenting only with a nod. Later, Leaphorn had noticed Baker, huddled in a bulky fur-collared coat, watching a young man who stood in the back door of a camper, talking to a young woman in a heavy mackinaw. Leaphorn felt a sudden impulse to walk up to Baker, grab him by the lapels, tell him about Bowlegs, asking him to forget about this manhunt for an hour and help find the Navajo boy. Baker would be good at it, smart, fast, always thinking. But the impulse died aborting. Baker would refuse to be distracted from whomever he was stalking. At 1 a.m., when Leaphorn decided he wouldn't find Bowlegs, he was in the left gallery room of one of the Shalako houses on the hill. The bruise on his stomach ached with a steady throb. His eyes burned with tobacco smoke, incense, and stale air. He had finally worked his way up to the long window that looked down into the spectators, jamming the benches and chairs in the dirt-floored room below him. He had scanned carefully every face visible through the opposite gallery. Now he leaned heavily on the sill and let mind and muscles relax. He was very tired. Almost directly below him and to his left, a wooden altar stood, and on the floor the giant Shalako danced. From where Leaphorn stood by the gallery window on the floor above, he was almost at eye level with the great bird. It danced, its great horns glittering with reflected light, its fan of top-knot feathers bristling, its voice the hooting call of the night birds. Leaphorn scanned the crowd again. Below him there were mostly women, Zuñis in their ceremonial best, a scattering of Navajos. To his right, 2 young Navajo men had edged their way near the window. They were drinking, Leaphorn saw. If he weren't so tired, he would move them out into the cold, sobering air. Instead, he would move himself from here, where George Bowlegs obviously wasn't. As he decided this, he saw George Bowlegs. The boy was across the dance room in the opposite gallery, staring almost directly toward Leaphorn at the shalico swooping down the dance floor. Leaphorn recognized him instantly. The generous mouth, the large expressive eyes, the short-cropped hair. More than that, there was something about the boy that suggested the strange and the lonely. He was no farther away than the width of the dance room, perhaps a dozen yards. Leaphorn began pushing his way back from the window, struggling through the packed humanity toward the passageway that connected the two galleries. It took him 2 full minutes to fight his way through to the doorway. It was blocked as well. Finally, he was in the right gallery. He pushed his way through the crowd, looking frantically. The boy was nowhere. Outside, Leaphorn thought. He must have gone out. Outside, the snow was falling heavily. Leaphorn pulled up his collar, gave his eyes a second to adjust, and peered into the darkness. Something, no more than a glimpse of movement, disappeared in the alleyway between the Shalico house and another of the cut-stone houses of old Zuñi. Leaphorn followed at a trot. The alley was utterly dark. Leaphorn ran down it, stopped at its mouth. The alley opened into the unlit plaza just above the mission church. A small figure was now moving across it at a slow walk. Leaphorn stopped, peering through the sifting snow. Was it George? At that moment began a series of events which Leaphorn never quite straightened out in his memory. First, from the blackness of another alleyway, there came a wavering, hooting call. The walking figure stopped, turned, shouting something joyful, which might have been the Navajo word for yes, and Leaphorn stood for some small measure of time, undecided. Whatever time he wasted, 2 ticks of his watch, or 5, became time enough for George Bowlegs to die. Leaphorn moved just as the boy's figure disappeared into the mouth of darkness. He moved frantically. His boots skidded on the wet snow, and he fell heavily on his hands. And when he had scrambled again to his feet, he had lost another 2 or 3 seconds. It was then he heard the sound, actually a double sound. Thump-crack! Loud but muffled. He pulled his pistol from his holster as he ran. At the alley opening he stopped, knowing he was too late. George Bowlegs lay on his side just inside the alley. Leaphorn crouched beside him. And then there was another sound, this one a thump, followed by a muffled yell, followed by a scuffling, followed by a silence. Leaphorn moved cautiously down the alley, hearing nothing now, seeing nothing. He pulled his flashlight from his coat pocket. The heavy snow ahead of him bore a single set of boot prints, and then, at the empty doorway of an abandoned home, a jumble of footprints, and on the snow a plume of feathers. It was the decoration that had topped the fierce mask of the Salamovia. Leaphorn flashed his light into the empty building. There was fresh snow on the earthen floor. Part of it had sifted in through the broken roof, and part had come from the feet of men. He flashed the light around, saw nothing, and ran back up the alley to where George Bowlegs lay. He knelt in the snow, his face against the boy's, hoping to feel a breath. "The sacred wind of your life I breathe," Leaphorn thought. But the sacred wind was gone. Snowflakes sifted through the beam of the flashlight, dusting the boy's tangled hair with white, clinging to an eyelash, melting on the still warm face. Leaphorn gently turned the body and felt through the pockets of the ragged jacket. It was then that Leaphorn noticed the prayer plume. George must have been carrying it in his hand, holding it out, offering it, and when the bullet struck, the boy had fallen on it. It was beautifully made, its blue and yellow songbird feathers neatly arranged, and tied to the willow with a thong was a cold stone symmetry of a perfect Stone Age lance point. This one, unbroken, slender, formed with parallel flaking, a relic from 7,000 or 8,000 years in the past, a perfect offering to the gods. Leaphorn took off his jacket and spread it carefully over the face of George Bowlegs. From somewhere in the dark across the plaza, he heard the brief sound of flutes and chanting. No one seemed to have heard the muffled shot. No one, except whoever had seized the killer and pulled him into the empty house. Leaphorn walked back down the alley, examining the footprints in the snow. The killer had been running. He wore boots size 10, Leaphorn guessed. Apparently he had seen Leaphorn after he had fired the shot. But as he passed this doorway, something had stopped him. Already the tracks were softened and blurred by fresh falling snow. Inside the empty building, Leaphorn took his time. There was no longer any reason to hurry, and he meticulously sorted out what the snow tracks had to tell him. There had been 3 persons wearing moccasins. Leading from the alley into the doorway, there were drag marks left by boot heels. The moccasins trailed snow through the 2 empty rooms, left fresh tracks in a third roofless room, and then departed over a fallen wall onto the street. Here the tracks indicated that 2 of the men bore a heavy burden. Leaphorn followed them for perhaps 50 yards. He lost them where they crossed a village street that had been heavily used. He was motivated only by a mild curiosity now. Everything was finished. Back in the alley, Leaphorn squatted and picked up the dead boy, his arms under the legs and shoulders. He guessed he was again violating O'Malley's procedures by moving the body. But he would not allow this boy to lie here alone in the icy darkness. He was taking Bowlegs home. But where was home for this boy who had hunted heaven? Sunday, December 7, 9 a.m. Inside Ted Isaac's homemade camper, the kerosene heater roared, but icy air seeped through cracks eddying around Leaphorn's snow-covered boots and up the legs of his trousers. "I can't say I expected any company today, but I'm glad you came. When this lets up, I'm going to that commune and see about Susie." "She left yesterday. Halsey kicked her out. The last time I saw her, she was at the Zuñi police station. That was about noon yesterday. The federal officers were talking to her." "Where is she now?" "I don't know." "My God!" Isaacs looked at Leaphorn. "She didn't have any place to go." "Yeah, that's what I was telling you a couple of days ago." Leaphorn didn't try to keep the anger from his voice. "Here, I came to bring you something." He fished the broken lance tip from his pocket and handed it to Isaacs. "Parallel flaked. Where'd you Isaac turned abruptly to the file case and rummaged. When he closed the drawer, he had a second piece of flint in his hand. "George Bowlegs had it. He buried it where he killed a deer. Sort of a fetish offering." Isaacs was staring at him. "Does it match?" "I think so." The anthropologist put both pieces on the Formica table. The broken butt he had slipped out of the envelope from the filing cabinet, and the tip Bowlegs had buried. Isaac's fingers adjusted them. They fit perfectly. Isaacs looked up, his face strained. "Man, if Reynolds finds out that the boy got this, he'll kill me. But how could he have gotten it?" Carter gave it to him. Carter stole it out of that box in the back of Reynolds' pickup truck, along with some other artifacts. And he gave some of it to George. "But Reynolds said nothing was missing." Isaac stared at Leaphorn. "Wait a minute. He couldn't have gotten this out of Reynolds' truck. Reynolds couldn't have had it." Suddenly he looked sick. "He couldn't have, but he did. Reynolds was salting the site. Isn't that your word for it? Salting? Anyway, he was planting stuff for you to find." "I don't believe it." Isaac sat down. A stricken face said he did believe it. His eyes were looking past Leaphorn at the wreckage of everything. Ernesto did his little bit of stealing just at the wrong time. It spoiled a lot of work. Reynolds had gotten himself a supply of the sort of flint Folsom man liked. and then he prepared his evidence. I'd guess he made some bits and pieces of parallel flaked artifacts. He'd have saved the chips and the broken stuff and all. And then he started roughing out some pressure-flaked Folsom-type artifacts from the very same pattern flint. He didn't really need the fine finished product, which you say is hard to counterfeit. All he needed was the unfinished, broken stuff. Leaphorn paused, waiting for Isaacs to say something. Isaac stared blindly at the wall. Maybe Reynolds' theory is true. It sounds sensible enough. But I guess Reynolds wasn't willing to wait to prove it. He wanted to make his critics eat crow. I don't know exactly how he did it. Probably made himself some sort of tong-like gadget to hold the flint and punch them down to the hard layer where you were finding the stuff. He couldn't do it in advance because he had to place the planted stuff in the right location relative to the genuine artifacts you were finding. Yeah, he'd check in here a lot about sundown or so and would go over what I'd found and where I'd find it. And then while I was cooking supper, he'd take his flashlight and go out there and inspect the dig. That would be when he did it. And that's why everything seemed to fit so perfectly. Isaacs looked at Leaphorn. And then Kata stole some of the stuff he was planting. So Reynolds killed Kata? Do you think that's enough reason for him to kill the boy? It was something that puzzled him. Of course. Hell yes. Once he found out some of his artifacts were missing and Kata had them, I guess he'd have to do it. Leaphorn's doubt seemed to puzzle Isaacs. Maybe you don't know how serious it would be to salt a site. My God! It's unthinkable. This whole science is based on everybody being beyond suspicion. When this gets out, Reynolds will be worse than finished. It's just unthinkable. How did you figure it out? Remember when you found the parts of those broken points right together? Well, that bothered me. It would seem more natural when you spend an hour trying to make something and all of a sudden it breaks, to lose your temper and throw it half a mile. You don't just politely drop it at your feet. Not if it keeps happening. Yeah, I guess that bothered me a little too. Only I didn't let myself think about it. When Reynolds chased Kata away from the truck, he must have checked right away and found some of his stuff gone. Leaphorn fished the unbroken point from his pocket and handed it to Isaacs. This had been taken too, and probably other material. It was bad enough Kata having it, but when he got it was fatal. What if he got a guilty conscience and brought it back and gave it to you? You'd ask where he got it and when. And then you'd have known Reynolds was putting the stuff in the ground for you to find. So he went out to kill Kata. I think he just went out to get the stuff back. I think he rigged himself up a Kachina mask so Kata wouldn't recognize him and planned to scare the boy into giving him the stuff. But the boy tried to get away from him. If you haven't arrested him yet, he's in Tucson this weekend, but he's coming back Monday. He wasn't in Tucson. When Reynolds killed Kata, he found the boy had just part of the missing stuff with him. The most damaging pieces were missing. And then he learned that Bowlegs had been here with him, so Bowlegs must have this most important fragment. Leaphorn tapped the broken lance tip. You'd already found the butt, and Bowlegs had the tip. So he had to find George and make sure he got the tip back before he could kill him. Now Reynolds was covering up a murder, too. He wore the Kachina mask when he was prowling around the commune, seeing if George was there. If someone saw Reynolds, Reynolds was in trouble. If somebody reported seeing a Kachina, you'd think they were crazy or drunk or just superstitious. But he didn't, did he? He didn't get George. He killed George last night. You'll need this, then. Isaacs pushed the broken point toward him. That'll be some evidence, anyway. I'll bet you can hang him. We'll never find him. I guess you'd say there's an old law that takes precedence over the white man's penal code. It says, "Thou shalt not profane the sacred ways of Zuñi." He explained to Isaacs about the footprints in the alley. I don't think anybody is ever going to know what happened to Reynolds. A few days from now, somebody will come across his pickup, wherever he left it, and it'll go into the records as a missing person. Leaphorn pushed the point back toward Isaacs. I don't need this. The FBI has jurisdiction in this business, and the FBI isn't interested in Indian superstitions and broken stones and all that. It's got another solution in mind. Isaacs picked up the points, juggled them in his palm. Then he stared at Leaphorn. Do whatever you want to do. I'm finished with all this. I just had one little job. I was supposed to find George Bowlegs. I screwed it up. He's found, but not soon enough. What you're saying is that nobody but you and I and Reynolds knew the site was fixed, and you're saying Reynolds is dead. And I'm saying that when I leave here, I'm going to the Rama chapter house and get back to work on a deal involving a down payment on a pickup truck. Isaacs was still staring at him wordlessly. Come on. I'm saying, just how much do you want fame and fortune and a faculty job? A couple of days ago, you wanted it worse than you wanted that girl of yours. How about now? You want it bad enough to lie a little? I'm saying nobody's going to guess this bastard of a dig was salted unless you tell them it was. And then maybe then they won't even believe you. Who in hell would believe the great Chester Reynolds would salt a dig? Joe Leaphorn opened the camper door and stepped out in the snow. I'm trying to learn more about white men. You wanted all that worse than you wanted your woman. What else will you give up for it? He'd left his carryall on the shoulder of the highway. The motor was still warm and it started easily, the chains making a muted song where the wind had left clear spots on the pavement. He would make a circle up New Mexico 53 to Interstate 40 in case Susie was trying to hitchhike. And if she was, he'd give her a ride into Gallup and loan her the $10 bill he had in his billfold. And maybe someday he would write a note to O'Malley and let him know who killed Ernesto Cata. But probably not.
Copyright 1989, The Audio Partners, Incorporated.